Look, this was a deep, deep dive.
And if they wanted to be the Atlantis Journal, right, they could have left this be. But because of the publicity surrounding Graham Hancock's show, which everyone had seen because it had premiered the year before, right, everyone already knew about this stuff because Graham Hancock had been promoting it. Giant earthwork. It's a giant portrait of a grotesque Hercules. The grotesque Hercules is Hercules with an erection. So think about that. This guy, Saturn, that you see in a 1500s monumental architecture in Scotland is a version of the oldest god ever worshipped in Mesopotamia. What is the word giant? Giant is the same as Anunnaki. The Anunnaki are the children of Anu and Ki. What does giant mean in Greek? Giant are the children of Ga. Who's Ga? Greek Ga, Mesopotamian Ki, Ga, Gaia, Ki, right? The Earth Mother. Mother Earth is the mother of the giants. It's because of Donnelly, right, that the two floods become the same flood, and that's the same idea that carries forward today in like the work of Graham Hancock and other people who are like modern Atlantis researchers. But by the middle 20th century, theosophy, the right wing of theosophy in particular, Western esoteric cult mysticism is strongly connected to anti-Semitic ideology and to the things that ultimately lead to the Holocaust. And we believe that Germanic people invented writing and civilization in Atlantis, located in the North Atlantic, right? And spread culture and civilization out of Northern Europe into the rest of the world. So all advanced civilization is German. Oh yeah, he thought Atlantis was 2 million years old. And he and others like him take deep offense to people pointing out the historical association between the Nazis and Atlantis teachings, right? Even it's a real historical connection between Western occult mysticism, the political far right, and the genocidal efforts of the Nazis. Robert Sepper, whose channel is called Atlantean Gardens, I feel like we're definitely punching up. He's way more popular than he should be because he's somebody who says, and I quote, "Before you say that Hitler ruined the ancient Aryan symbol, consider that it is banned because he actually knew what he was talking about historically." He literally chose the symbol of the Third Reich as the logo for his channel. Hello, I'm Joseph A.P. Wilson, and I am a lecturer in classical archaeology at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And I'm here to follow up with Derek after his really cool interview with my fellow classical archaeologist from the University of Cardiff, Flint Dibble. So he introduced this topic, and I want to kind of broaden it a little bit and talk a lot today about the lost continent of Atlantis and how that relates to ancient Near Eastern mythology and to the rise of Western occult traditions known as theosophy, and which have a lot of modern implications. So whether you're a skeptic, like most of us are, about these radical claims about 10,000-year-old advanced civilizations, or whether you're a believer, because, I really favor talking to everybody about this. I am not hostile to the idea that there are missing pieces of the puzzle out there. So either side that you come down on these contentious debates, I hope that you can find something that you will enjoy here. There's also been a lot of not too nice behavior on social media surrounding this, and a lot of bad blood. Unfortunately, this is a topic that gets a lot of anger and a lot of resentment associated with it. And so we're going to deal a little bit with the dark side of this stuff, particularly the bad behavior surrounding these kinds of topics among influencers. I'm only going to talk about influencers that have more subscribers than Derek. I don't want to punch down to any small channels. There's lots of people talking shit. Pardon my French. I apologize. You can delete that out. There's lots of people who make fuss about this, but I don't want to go after anybody who's not a big enough fish to take the heat. Okay. So a good place to begin is with Graham Hancock's new-ish show. It's premiered 2 years ago on Netflix, Ancient Apocalypse, and it just got renewed for a second season in 2025. So this is really big. It's run by their straight-up legitimate documentary side, and it's being presented as a real ancient history / archaeology documentary, a serious academic sort of thing. And this instantly aroused the protest of the Society for American Archaeology. so within weeks. So it premiered in first half of November 2022. And a couple of weeks later, the Society for American Archaeology basically said, Netflix is irresponsible for labeling this stuff science. It should be labeled science fiction. And they also called out some of the history of racist ideas connected to some of these beliefs. And this has caused endless conflict between the proponents and opponents of the Atlantis stuff. Particularly the idea of an ancient lost civilization from the Ice Age with high technology and monumental architecture, seafaring across the globe and all this stuff that's associated with Graham Hancock. I agree what the Society for American Archaeology is saying here. I think it is better to classify Atlantis documentaries as closer to science fiction. That said, I think science fiction is a serious topic, right? I think that we should talk more about the stuff as scholars and to communicate why specifically this is. And I think we should be respectful. There are racists involved in this, but not everyone who believes in this stuff is racist. And so I think it's our duty as scholars to engage in a way that is fundamentally open to dissenting views so that we can, have a respectful response where people don't feel alienated by professionals. There's a lot of scapegoating and casting people as the bad guys. And I would like to, even as I call out some of the bad guys as I see them, I'm going to try to point out that you don't necessarily have to believe in toxic ideas in order to believe in Atlantis. Okay. Where did Graham Hancock start? He started with the very first episode of Ancient Apocalypse, which was called Once There Was a Flood. And this is where one of the big controversies that was leading into the Flint Dibble interview on the Joe Rogan podcast. So Flint Dibble and Graham Hancock had a polite debate on Joe Rogan. And one of the things what they were talking about was the controversy over this pyramid claim. And this first episode, Graham Hancock says, humans are a species with amnesia. What are we a species with amnesia? What does this mean? We've forgotten our real past. We've forgotten that 10,000, 15,000 years ago, we were advanced, high civilization, urban empire type civilization that was spread all around the world, and that it collapsed in a cataclysm. And then we kind of reverted, according to him, we reverted back to like Stone Age lifestyle, and then had to slowly pull ourselves out of that Stone Age existence that was caused by the ancient apocalypse. And so
I just want to comment on this to say, again, I have my own experience with being fascinated with Graham and these ideas, which inspired me in a way to go and take this stuff more seriously. This was an introduction to comparative mythology, and the Randall Carlsons on Joe Rogan with Graham Hancock. You list the names, the top names. They inspired me to do this because psychologically, I don't know what it is to pin it down. There's some fascination with imagining we've been here before and we're repeating something, or we lost this deep history to ourselves, this lost link to something about ourselves. And it's really interesting. I remember thinking about it. I said this the last time on Flint Dibble's discussion with me. I said to my wife once, we were at dinner and she was coming to travel to meet me. And I said, honey, 30, 40,000 years ago, imagine there were humans eating at a restaurant or eating somewhere where they eat, where they serve food. And, imagine 30 to 40,000 years from now. And they said, have you ever heard the story of America? And she's like, no, what are you talking about? That's a myth. Kind of makes you think like, oh, snap, we're restarting. And there's something about that that's intriguing to the human, whether it's fiction or not.
Absolutely. And in fact, we do have stories of ancient apocalypses, and we'll get into that. There are massive civilizational collapse events that we know about and that we didn't know about until we excavated, right, and found inscriptional evidence. So it's written texts from the Bronze Age, particularly, that have revealed that actual massive civilizations did come crashing to a halt because of various natural and human-caused disasters. And it is very, very fascinating. But the problem is there isn't one big explanation for everything. That's where the mainstream archaeology really parts company with the folks that are trying to push these dates back into the Ice Age. First of all, the Ice Age is a place where there isn't that evidence. We deal with that evidence in the period of recorded history, which is after the Ice Age, right? So that's one problem. But the problem isn't that we're talking about ancient apocalypses. We should absolutely talk about ancient apocalypses, but we should talk about the various individual ones that happened all over the place, at different places and times. And so we're going to try to introduce that nuance. So that's getting to where I was saying, oh, by the way, I was also somebody I've told you before that I came from hippie radicals people when I was like growing up in the 80s. And a lot of my parents' old hippie friends were into this. And I knew people who were authors and editors, non-mainstream archaeology journals where they were taking these claims very seriously. And I was exposed to some of this stuff before I got a formal training in archaeology and religious studies. I went into both archaeology and religious studies as an undergrad and graduate student, partially because of the interest that this stuff stoked in me as a teenager, right? When I was in junior high and high school and I was reading these magazines. And so now I know a lot of the people on the debunking side, right? I know a lot of them through social media, and I'm in New England where a number of prominent archaeological skeptics like myself reside here in the U.S. Northeast. So like go down to Connecticut, and Ken Fader is there. He wrote the Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries book, the main textbook on the debunking side. So I have a foot in both worlds, and that's where my kind of respect for both sides comes from. But at the same time, I bring critical scholarship, and so I can't avoid criticizing the mistakes that I see on the fringe side. Okay, so getting back to this slide, let's just really quick. He claims in this episode that some kind of natural disaster, we'll eventually learn all about the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the notion of a comet, a massive cataclysm caused by an extraterrestrial object colliding with the Earth, causing massive climate change, which he says it ends the ice age, it causes the warming up of the world, and this is what destroys the previous civilization, according to him. And he thinks that the mythology of the global flood, which you see in societies around the world, and he particularly cites the flood of Noah, he cites the flood of Manu in Hinduism, which is like the Hindu Noah. He mentions the Greek version, so there's different versions of the same story all around the world. He says they're all the same event. He's implying this cataclysm is remembered by everyone because it affected everyone. It's passed down independently through all these different civilizations. Right. And then he says what he calls a pyramid, Gunung Padang in Indonesia, which he says is the survivor of the sunken continent that is off the coast of Indonesia, according to him. And the continent sinks with all of its ancient 25,000-year-old pyramids. And the one that's left is the one that he shows in this first episode. So is Gunung Padang really the oldest pyramid in the world? Like Discover magazine is asking on the basis of this controversial thing. And so there's the link to the article where that headline is from. No, it's not. As Flint Dibble in his great debunking tweets has pointed out, the charcoal layers that have been dated that show when the construction was done, these charcoal layers are all less than 2,500 years old. It's about 2,300, 2,100. So just before the Common Era. That's when the temple was built. Why else is it not the oldest pyramid? Because it's not a pyramid. Pyramids have to have square or triangular bases, right? Pyramid that is oval shaped. So it is neither the oldest pyramid, nor is it even a pyramid. It's a terraced temple on the top of a hill with a ridge slope, a ridge line along it. There are a lot of these pseudo-archaeological claims about ancient pyramids where they're actually just pointing at natural landscapes. This happened right after the premiere of that episode. So the expert that Graham Hancock cited is Dr. Hillman, as he's called, Danny Hillman, or Natawijaja, pardon my bad pronunciations. He is the leader of a geology team that has been arguing for more than a decade that this is a 25,000-year-old pyramid, or 18 to 25,000-year-old pyramid. And he has radiocarbon dated the base of the structure and C14 dates. So isotopic dating, you date decay of radioactive isotopes in organic remains of carbon, and the rate of decay is how we date using carbon-14. And so he's dated the physical structure, as he calls it, at the base of the pyramid, and he managed to get a research article claiming this. Didn't mention Atlantis because you don't put that in mainstream archaeology journals, but he managed to get this published in Archaeological Prospection. But then by March of this year, the journal retracted the article. They retracted the article for reasons that we'll get into in a second. But this was the major controversy that was right before the Joe Rogan podcast interview. So right before Flint and Hancock sat down, this was like the smoke was still clearing on this major journal retraction. retraction, which is being hyped as a super big scandal by the pro-Atlantis crowd, because they're saying, look, this guy did all the right stuff. He got it through a proper peer-reviewed academic journal. It was published. And then what happened? People like mean old Flint Dibble and all these mean old archaeologists started complaining about how it was bad. And then the journal said, whoops, and said, did we publish this? No, we didn't mean to do that. And they retracted it. And so literally the proponents have been blaming people like Flint, not just Flint. Flint, they haven't singled me out because I'm not prominent enough. I'm not a big enough name for them to know who I am. But among my friends on social media, I know most of the skeptical archaeologists who tweet and use Facebook to talk about Graham Hancock and why he's wrong, right? And so I know most of these guys, and so they get the blame. People, both the grassroots on social media and the big guns like Graham Hancock, say that Flint and his colleagues put pressure on in the media. And the accusation is that this caused the journal to get cold feet and pull it back and humiliate the author. And so I just want to say, and he called Flint Dibble the witchfinder general. He compared it to an inquisition, like with ancient heretics being burned at the stake for believing things that were not orthodox. And so this is representing mainstream archaeology as a dogmatic orthodoxy with like codes of belief. And you have like, you can't believe in ancient ice age civilizations or else we will retract your articles. This is what they're saying. And this is not true. And I'll show you how on the next slide. If you look at the retraction, you'll notice that the only article that has cited this in the citation metrics is a Nature News article from November of 2023. This was published in late October, and the investigation which led to the retraction happened in November of 2023. So what do you see where I'm coming at, Derek?
Yeah.
Are you reading between the lines?
Yeah, bottom right, citation 1, Nature, 28th November 2023. Seems to be Nature citing it. So we should look at Nature, correct?
So Nature is citing it. And in that article, they're saying this journal is investigating this paper for possible retraction. So in other words, the process of the retraction took 5 months. It happened right before the podcast interview, which was after all the social media stuff. The social media stuff was coincidental. The reason why the journal was retracted it is because of people internal to the journal, right? It was the journal editors and peer reviewers that were already in contact with the editors. They red flagged it as soon as it was published, right? The wheels were rolling on this retraction the day it appeared in print, and that had nothing to do with Flint Dibble. It had nothing to do with any of the other boogeyman, mean, real art, PhDs who don't like Graham Hancock. They didn't get this retracted.
But let me push back just 1 second in order to kind of maybe help people who are viewing this. And in this case, let's just suppose that experts in the field were reaching out saying, you really should investigate this because this looks to be like a bunk piece, or this looks to be a bit conspiratorial. Right. Not based on the evidence. The people who are pushing or peddling the pro-Atlantean, pro-ancient ice age, pre-younger Dryas civilizations, advanced technology, ancient aliens, all of that, they're still going to use this propagandistic conspiracy. They're out to get us. The 1%ers they want to hide this truth. All this, you name it, the list of different things are going to be used. Yeah. No matter what, whether or not this was just authentically within, as you're pointing out, or if there's another case where experts are chiming in going, what is this? You're like putting out nonsense. They would still use this as kind of a weaponized propaganda to get their followers, their constituency, to be on their side no matter what.
So all that's true. And I think that the retraction has ironically brought more attention to that. And so I think there's different constituencies with different interests here. The reason why it was in the journal's interest to do this is because the journal was worried about their own reputation.
Right.
They're not worried about archaeology as a discipline. They're not worried about what other people in other parts of the academy think. Mm-hmm. This journal is only concerned about their reputation as a geoarchaeology journal. Geoarchaeology is a serious, hardcore, very strong scientific discipline, right? And if they wanted to be the Atlantis journal, right, they could have left this be. But because of the publicity surrounding Graham Hancock's show, which everyone had seen because it had premiered the year before, right? Everyone already knew about this stuff because Graham Hancock had been promoting it. So Graham Hancock promoted it. This article gets published. People who are aware of the problems based on Graham Hancock's promotion, I'm sure a lot of them from various places might have reached out here, but it was mainly the people who were publishing in the journal themselves, because this journal at the same time was publishing articles critical of this stuff, right? Like literally in the same issue that this came out, there were other issues that were other articles that were kind of diametrically the opposite. So it's those authors and peer reviewers who are the ones whose personal reputations are on the line, right? Because their own publication is getting tainted by association with this bad piece. So I don't necessarily support retractions in general. I think retractions should only be done. My personal view is retractions should only be done for clear academic dishonesty, like plagiarism, things like that. Those should, or malfeasance where people are deliberately doing studies wrong. The fact is that there was none of that here. No one thinks that these guys are dishonest. They think that they're just wrong. And why are they wrong? They're wrong because what they carbon dated was just dirt. And they claim that there are structures there, but no one agrees. No archaeologist agrees with them. There's one archaeologist in the paper, but he's not a specialist in the relevant area. And entirely a team of geologists. And what was the journal's mistake? The journal's mistake was they only asked geologists to do the peer review. So when it ran through the peer review, there were no archaeologists that I'm aware of that did the reviews, right? It was reviewed entirely by geoscientists, and the geoscientists were reviewing the quality of the geological testing, right? They were saying this radiocarbon date was run correctly, right? They were saying, and the geological arguments held water, but where it failed was they were arguing that there were built structures where there weren't any. They're doing natural rock slides. There are like natural cavities that form. It's a basalt. It's basically a bunch of columns of basalt that have cracked out of old lava beds, and they're pushed up on these hills. And when they built the temple, they hauled a bunch of these basalt columns up and built the temple structure out of the basalt columns. And then these basalt columns erode and slide down the hill. And at the base of the hill, there are some, eroded structural elements that it might have come down from rock falls and things. But most of what's at the base is just natural hill, right? The temple is on the top. So when he drills a 40-foot core deep into the hillside and extracts organic material from 40 feet below the surface, and he declares in the paper that that's in the middle of a buried structure that we see with remote sensing, radar, like these high technology gadgets that you use to look under the surface of the ground. Any archaeologist or good geoarchaeologist knows. I did it for my master's work. I did an archaeological excavation in Michigan where we used geophysics for archaeologists to look inside of big earth structures. And how did we determine whether the structures were what we thought we were? Not just with the geophysics. You can't just use these blurry images from your radar. What do you have to do? Physically dig it up, right? The only way to prove that it is what you think it is to dig it up. So basically he's saying, this looks like a structure. He digs dirt out of the base of the hill, radiocarbon dates it, and guess what? 40 feet below the mountain, you have ice age dirt. So yes, this hill has been there since the Pleistocene. It didn't have any human activity on top, or, there were hunters and gatherers living around there. They didn't build massive temples on top of the hill in the Ice Age. Those are less than 2,000 years old. So the cause for the retraction is legitimate. Hancock and others say they should have left it there and just published critical articles. I kind of favor that view. I agree with Hancock. They should have left it because it draws too much attention. This is an expression in Chinese. It's a 4-character aphorism or proverb in Chinese. Yu gai mi zhang. Yu gai mi zhang means what you try to cover up only becomes more obvious. It's the Streisand effect. Remember when Barbara Streisand tried to prevent the publication of a ecology report about beach erosion that had a photograph of her mansion in it, and her lawyer tried to get them to censor the photograph of Barbara Streisand's mansion. And this obscure scientific report that had a picture of a house in it that 4 people would have read, right? They tried to suppress it, and what happened? 40 million people looked at Barbara Streisand's. How do you make this stuff more prominent? How do you raise its status? Now everyone knows about this article because of the retraction. So what the journal did for their own best interest of their reputation, you can see it from their perspective. But from the perspective of, those of us who would rather people didn't take this stuff as seriously, right? We say, wow, look what happened. Now it's a huge big deal, whereas it wasn't before. It was just been a minor like a blip in the radar, another thing. So this is the real work that Hancock cites in his books, though, because it's his earlier publication on the subject. Dr. Hillman wrote a book in 2013 called Plato Never Lied, always told the truth. Atlantis is in Indonesia. And the book's introductions are written by important Indonesian people, including a high-ranking presidential advisor for the ruling party of Indonesia, currently the head of the electrical grid for the entire country, Andi Arief. And he confidently stated in his introduction that Plato read a manuscript written by Solon, and that it was a truth about Atlantis was written in a manuscript by Solon. This is something a middle school social studies teacher should know is false, right? Plato never claimed to have a manuscript written by Solon. Plato's claims were that he had a family legend that was passed down from Solon, who was this great, distant relative through other distant relatives. And then it was a story someone told to Socrates. So Dr. Hillman is not a Plato scholar. He's making really fundamental errors. If you read the jacket description, and by the way, I have no interest in mocking anyone for being an English language learner.
Right. This
book is not written in competent English. It is written in very, very non-fluent English. It needed an editor. And I am a journal editor. I'm a co-editor of an interdisciplinary journal that publishes a wide variety of topics. And I have edited submissions from international scholars who do not speak good English well. And these are very difficult tasks, but it's worth it when the scholarship is worth it. I will bring it up. Whoever published this, it's a self-published book, left very, very, very unintelligible passages throughout the book. So you can see just from the jacket description that it's hard to say what it's even arguing. It's written in such poor English. So, but unfortunately, that's the way it is. So if you want to review this, you probably need to find the Indonesian original. I don't know if there is an Indonesian original, and you'd have to have someone who is a good Indonesian reader to critically comment on it. But as a result, I can't really talk about the content of this book very much, even though it's central to Hancock. He really grabs onto it. But I'm going to come back to the Plato never lied thing, because that's the critique of what we call the noble lie in Plato. And the pro-Atlantis people say that Plato was actually telling the truth. So this is going to be kind of like a running theme through the rest of the presentation. All right. I think the story of Atlantis is like an urban legend or an urban myth. An urban myth in modern days is like the story when you tell what sounds like a far-fetched, strange but true story. And how do you know it's true? Because someone that I'm distantly aware of has told me about it. So urban myths are like, the alligators in the sewers, or the time the babysitter dropped acid and cooked the baby by mistake and put the turkey in the crib. How do you know that happened? Because my Aunt Susie told me that her, hairdresser's daughter was the cousin of the guy, right? So Atlantis really has the structure of an urban myth. And that is also because Atlantis was an urban empire, right? Atlantis was the center of the Athenian Empire, which was in decline. It was falling apart. It was losing. It had lost, right? It was the story is taking place is in the process of losing the Peloponnesian War. Plato's writing about it after that ship has sailed. And he's talking about this family legend that's been passed down for generations from Solon. This is Sonchis of Sais, who is the Egyptian priest who allegedly told Solon about Atlantis. This is his portrait. I'm using this portrait of a Saite priest to stand in. As we said, urban legend is a humorous or horrific story, outrageous. It sounds unbelievable, but it's told as true, really true, by someone who has like this vague connection to a distant source of information. It's like Plato does this a lot when he talks about ancient Egyptian information. He says, it's true, really. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. Like another example is in the Book of Laws, the second Book of Laws. He has a generic Athenian, one of his dialogue people, who's just a guy from Athens. And he talks about things written in Egypt 10,000 years ago. And he follows it up and I say, I mean that literally. Like exactly 10,000 years. See what I mean? So it's like this like emphasizing its truthiness. The actual source is just an assertion. It's not like there's no like hard evidence.
Like adding to this idea, because there was so much competition, especially during this period and later, about, trust me, my guy's older and taught your guys, competing between like Moses and Pythagoras and Plato and all these guys throughout history. It wouldn't shock me even generically to go go to Egypt and see priests in Egypt going, our stuff it's thousands upon thousands. I mean, look at the Sumerian kings list, right? They have these extremely ancient dates for kings, etc.
And this is what the Greeks thought about the Egyptians. This is in Herodotus. I mean, the Greeks thought the Egyptians were 10,000 years old. They did. It's not just Plato. It's completely wrong, but it was the widespread belief because they recognized that the Egyptians were much more ancient than they were. They remembered their dark age when they lost literacy. That was recent history for them. And they knew that the Egyptians were much older than their classical literate phase that they had just sort of come into. They had returned to being literate. They started writing down their mythology, and they recognized our mythology is a young mythology, right, compared to the Egyptian stuff. So you're absolutely right that they're constantly using the example of Egyptian information as ancient. And yes, something being really ancient, it's more venerated, right? The older something is, the more important it is. It's like it's showing that this is a really powerful idea and not one that you can just dismiss as like something that we made up yesterday.
This derails from this, and I don't want to dwell on it. Makes sense why Josephus and other Jewish historians early on claimed to say Jews are Egyptians. Like they would literally try to tie into this ancient ancestral pedigree.
That's right. And the relationship between the Jews and the Egyptians is real and historical. Going back to the Bronze Age, there was tons. I mean, the Egyptians were an empire over the Levant, over Canaan, right? Canaan was under Egyptian control in the late Bronze Age. And before that, there were Canaanite incursions into Egypt, right? The Second Intermediate Period comes to an end when the Hyksos are kicked out by the Egyptians. So yeah, Josephus isn't completely far-fetched because he's talking about an integrated historical reality, right? Egypt and Canaan were not separate planets. They shared a border, in the Suez region, right? These are like Gaza, right? That southern Israel and Egypt are next door neighbors. So yeah, that's a completely reasonable thing for Josephus to push. All right, so just we're going to talk about this from a couple different angles. So in a nutshell, Plato says that Critias told Socrates, right, about a conversation that Solon, his distant ancestor, had with the Saite priest 11,600 years before today, or 9,000 years before Solon. So then later, and unfortunately, we don't have any early commentaries on Plato's Atlantis stuff that survive. We know that there were a lot of early commentaries on the Atlantis stuff, but they only get quoted third hand by much later ancient authors. So like Plutarch and like Eudorus's work is lost, Crantor's work is lost, but Proclus and Plutarch kind of summarize and put their own spin on the ancient commentaries. So that's where we get the name Sonchis. Is not from Plato, but the Egyptian guy is named Sonchis by the later commentaries that are like third, fourth generation like interpretations of Plato. And it's Proclus who says that Eudorus says that Crantor also went to Egypt and saw the original inscriptions. Because remember, Plato's saying that Solon hears from Sonchis that this is written in hieroglyphics on rock. That the Atlantis story is originally an Egyptian tale written in hieroglyphics on rock. And oh, by the way, Crantor saw it too. So people who believe in Atlantis are saying Crantor is like an independent corroboration of the veracity of what Plato says. And again, the last time to just talk about the urban legend thing, how does Plato's dialogues work? He takes historical people and he makes them dramatis personae, sort of the way that like Shakespeare writes about Julius Caesar, right? It's like, imagine telling a story about, like if I were to tell a story about my ancestor who knew George Washington and watched him chop down the cherry tree. See what I mean? Like I'm telling, like there's a legend from our national past and I'm integrating my family story into that legend. And I don't know quite when it happened. Maybe I'm confused about when George Washington actually lived. And so at the time of Plato, they didn't remember precisely when Solon lived. We now think he lived around 638 to 558 BCE, but Plato thought he was more recent. So Plato doesn't quite have his genealogy correct. We think there's some mistakes. And since the 19th century in German literature, they've analyzed all the anachronisms in the relationship between the historical people talked about by Plato. But he takes a bunch of real historical people, many of them his own relatives, and he makes them protagonists in these dialogues between historical people from his youth, right? When Plato was a young man, he knew a bunch of guys and they said this and they said that to each other. And he recounts these conversations that happened between Socrates and other Plato's cousins, right? So the story goes, Sonchis tells Solon, who is Plato's great uncle. He tells Plato's great grandfather, who's Critias III's great grandfather, And he tells Critias III's grandfather, who then, he's a 90-year-old guy, and he tells 10-year-old Critias, right, the story of Atlantis. And then 10-year-old Critias is now, he's an old man, and he tells Socrates. And that's 50 years before Plato remembers the story, right? So think about that, right? He's saying, my cousin, when I was a young man during the Peloponnesian War, my cousin had a conversation with Socrates about something his elderly grandfather heard from his elderly grandfather from my great uncle. So it's probably a real family legend that he's telling about Atlantis, or it might be, at least that's, we could say so. But is it true? What do you think, Dave? How does that sound like reliable evidence to you?
Because of the research that I've done on myth vision and like the scholars I talk to, the first thing I personally would like to look at is, because myths usually reflect the current or somewhat contemporaneous issues in the real world. And they can be complete fictions. The myths can be complete fictions, which actually give almost like an alternative reality, usually in heaven or in some type of otherly worldly location, but they reflect the current state of events that are taking place. So as an academic who, I don't know, I mean, I'm not one, but if I spoke to a Plato scholar, I would ask, what is happening historically at the time? And is there any evidence within Plato's narratives here that actually he's crafting this folk legend, this story, whatever this is, based on the Peloponnesian War, or based on the current things happening in the Greek world? And
boom,
you see what I'm saying?
You nailed it. You hit the nail right on the head. That's exactly what's happening. And the other two dialogue partners, Timaeus of Locri is probably fictional. He's a Greco-Italian. He's a Southern Italian Greek. And it's likely that he's been made up because Plato didn't know of any like virtuous Western philosophers. So he just plugged in a generic Western philosopher guy named Timaeus, who's living in Locri. But then the other historical person that's talking to Critias, besides Socrates, is Hermocrates, who is the general who kicked Athens' ass after the debacle after the debacle of the botched invasion of Syracuse. Ancient authors, again, we don't have the early commentaries. Most people think that Aristotle was an Atlantis skeptic, that he thought it was a myth that Plato made up, although the evidence for that isn't perfectly clear because it's all based on an ambiguous quote in Strabo. Strabo and later ancient authors who put Plato on a pedestal, they all thought he was telling the truth, right? So late ancient, medieval, early modern, a lot of people took for granted that Atlantis was a real place, right? It was taken because Plato said it, and he's a reliable source, right? You got to believe Plato. And so this has been the normal view throughout much of Western history, is taking for granted that there was a historical Atlantis. That only has changed in the late modern period as, skepticism has become a thing. So it's ironic that Graham Hancock thinks that he is like advancing some new idea here. Graham Hancock and other people like him are actually advocating for a return to a very traditional idea, right? One that was taken as true for a long time. And his idea that we are a species with amnesia doesn't make a lot of sense when everyone has these flood myths, right? If we're really a species with amnesia, then where is he getting all this data from? There's all this anthropological data that shows that there is this memory of this thing that we're passing down. Jason Colavito's blog is excellent. He's got a good article from 2011 on there, Strabo and Aristotle on Atlantis, where he talks about some of the historiographical issues with those early commentaries. Shout out to Jason a lot. He's a skeptic. He's a really good researcher, a popular history researcher on a number of topics. Can't recommend his blog enough to your listeners. The noble lie, the idea that a myth should be propagated to maintain social harmony, and it's okay if a myth isn't true as long as it is virtuous, as long as it promotes good things in the society. The noble lie is one of the central premises that Socrates invokes in the Republic. And the Republic is the first part of the story that finishes in Timaeus and Critias. So what we're dealing with is effectively an acephalous trilogy. And so now you'll see I'm getting the science fiction stuff in here. We're going to have Star Wars themes running through here, right? So according to Rosenmeyer in 1956, and I adopt this paradigm, the Republic plus Timaeus plus Critias, they weren't written to be a trilogy. There was supposed to be a fourth part or a conclusion to Critias that was never finished. So it wasn't exactly designed as a trilogy, but because the day of the Republic happens and then the conversation on the next day is a follow-up, right? Timaeus is a sequel to the Republic. So you have to start with the premises in the Republic and go from there. And in the Republic, he's talking about the ideal primordial Athens. and he's talking about the noble lie that, the myth that is constructed to maintain social harmony and why other myths suck. The myths that may be true but are evil, are bad, and shouldn't be taught, right? The myths that are false but good should be taught. You see what I'm saying? This is so this is the noble lie. So the idea that Plato never lied is an attack on the noble lie paradigm, which isn't invented by archaeologists. Archaeologists didn't come up with this. It's Plato scholarship and Plato himself, right? It's from Plato's own pen that this paradigm exists.
There are some scholars like Gad Barnea, and I know that they're pushing the boundaries of what typical consensus academia is saying about the Bible. I know this isn't in the relation technically of what you're discussing here, but it's important to make comment. Would see something like what Plato's saying here. I know that Russell Gamirkin, other guy, you've probably heard some of these names. They would say the biblical corpus we have is an example of this, where Jews are stretching a fictive history, claiming they have this primordial law, God giving down the laws and setting up that nation from way back in antiquity, and it gives them that pedigree. But that seems to be a common trope among civilizations, to kind of stretch back to the beginning of time or the beginning of creation and stuff. And here you have this social harmony in group that's saying this is our story that goes back to the beginning.
That's exactly right. And to be fair, I'm maybe a little less extreme on the noble lie than some people. I think that Plato did try to integrate historical information. And so I don't necessarily think that he thought of himself as lying when he talked about his family story here. But he knew that he was lying when he exaggerated, right? And there are obvious heavy-handed examples of hyperbole. And you know what I mean? Like when Plato is really stretching the truth to make a point, that's where I see the noble lie is implied. He wasn't using modern historiographic methods, and he had a lot of different assumptions about the past. So whether or not he thought he was lying about everything isn't really relevant, right? He was taking his truth and telling it for a didactic purpose, right? He had this understanding that came from his personal traditions, and he's inflecting it again in the context of the Peloponnesian War. Again, so now I'm citing the scholar Deborah Nails. Deborah Nails, so we're going to deal, again, the Star Wars theme here. Deborah Nails says that Plato's Republic is a constructive critique of Athenian democracy as it was practiced during the Peloponnesian War. He's living in the time when Athenian democracy has been in a long, slow decline. It's falling apart. Tyranny is replacing it, right? The Athenian Empire is no more, right? So the empire has crashed and burned. The state failed. The democratic system failed. He doesn't like democracy. Plato is an opponent of major features of democracy. He portrays Socrates as having been killed by democracy. His buddy Socrates is forced to drink poison because of democracy. So he is critiquing Athenian democracy as it has become an imperial superpower in the Aegean and has left nothing but destruction and death in its wake. It's like a colossal failure. And who are the good guys? He just came back from, remember Hermocrates, the Syracusan general? He had just come back from visiting Sicily, right? He had gone to Sicily, and he was saying the Sicily that was in a Republican period of its own then. And the Sicilian Republican period was a form of Republican government that Plato liked better than the failing one in Athens. So he has got the general that kicked one of the dialogue partners in the Atlantis story is the general that defeated the Athenian Empire's attempt to invade Sicily. See what we're doing? So what were you talking about? The geopolitics of that period is exactly what the war between Athens and Atlantis is about. You have to understand Athens as a proxy. Contemporary Athens is a proxy for ancient Atlantis. Contemporary Syracuse is a proxy for ancient Athens. It's like a role reversal between the protagonists in the ancient story versus what the recent histories. Oh, and this is also where Plato coined the word theology. We think of theology, right? Thank Plato. Plato is like the first historical person to use theology, and it's because he's promoting a different relationship with the gods. He wants to make the gods virtuous, and he wants to blame people for the problems in the world, as opposed to the earlier myths where the gods were assholes and people were their victims, right? Plato is showing the people are the bad guys and the gods are the good guys. And so this is just a little map of the Aegean and the Peloponnesian War. So you see the red state is the Athenian Empire. They decide to go invade Sicily. They waste 10 years. They basically destroy their navy. All historians agree that it was one of the worst blunders in classical military history. It was like the only people they'd agree about, the only disagreement is whether it was doomed to failure from the beginning or if it was the series of bad decisions that happened throughout it that resulted. I mean, the guy who launched the invasion was arrested and put on trial before the invasion even started. He was put on trial in Athens, right? Like Athenian people died in starvation camps in Sicily, right? This was like one of the stupidest things they could do. And it like put the final nail in the coffin on the Athenian Empire. And the Spartan supremacy was like, and Spartan control over Athenian fate is what proceeded after that. And when is the conversation happening? It's happening right after that. Like the scene, the Republic, and then right around that time, like Hermocrates died a couple years later. So dealing with that turn of the century moment is when the historical scene of the conversation about Atlantis is being thing. And so in Timaeus that's the creation story. Timaeus is Socrates says those old creation stories are bad. We hate them. They're true. Maybe they are true, but we should only tell them in secret to high initiated people. We shouldn't teach them to children. Teach these old mythology, teach it to children. It will cause them to think horrible things and behave badly. So let's suppress the true myths of antiquity and let's elevate our own like morally superior mythology. And so in Timaeus, he talks about the 5 Platonic solids, right? 4 elements, the 5th element, the dodecahedron, all that. So these basic like Platonic metaphysics, that's mainly what the Timaeus is about. They also interject about Atlantis, right? They interject and say, like Socrates says, yesterday when we were talking about the Republic, I was like painting a picture of a beautiful, fierce, wild animal. But you know what? A picture doesn't show it in action. A wild animal is supposed to do something. It's supposed to engage in a struggle, fight with its enemy. So he's imagining a sleeping lion, right? Or a sleeping gazelle that's supposed to be doing what? Running, attacking. He's like, if only one of you guys would tell a story where the ideal Athenian state was put to the test. Because a state has an army. A state has, it's like the lion with claws. What do you want? You want to see the virtuous proto-Athens, the original pure form of government in ancient Athens. You want to see it triumph over its foe the way a lion eats a gazelle. What does Hermocrates say? Hermocrates says, hey, Critias, that story you heard from your distant relative about Atlantis, you were telling me as we were leaving the hotel and coming here to talk to, as we were leaving the inn and coming here to talk to Socrates, you were telling me about that Atlantis place. That's a good answer. Tell Socrates all about the story of Atlantis. So then they start it and then they interrupt them and they go back to the creation story. And then the real bulk of the Atlantis comes in at episode 3. So yeah. And Critias says it's strange, but it's all true. So again, like the urban legend, like the alligators in the sewers. He said, I know it sounds ridiculous, but it really happened. And the fact that Hermocrates is the one who draws it out of him, Hermocrates never gets his long dialogue that's promised. So Socrates says, hold on, Hermocrates, you'll get your turn. So it's likely the missing end conclusion. What do we call the lost conclusion, which may be lost or may not never have been written? We call it informally Hermocrates, right? Timaeus, Critias, Hermocrates, in that order. So the missing chapter is Hermocrates, and that would have likely been the general, the guy who beat Athens, telling the story of the actual war, right? So he's going to describe the time the oppressive Atlantean tyrants were defeated by the plucky, virtuous Athenians before it was all destroyed by a flood and an earthquake. Again, this is just showing that Hermocrates was the guy who was responsible for the defeat of the Athenian navy, or, the defeat of not the whole navy. I shouldn't get too far ahead of myself. I don't want to get too much into the details because they're not in my head, but he was one of the major military leaders that resulted in the Athenian debacle in Syracuse. So he would be the perfect guy to talk about how Atlantis was defeated. Plato makes some pretty important continuity errors. And this goes back to the thing about antiquity. So in Timaeus and Critias, the character of Sanchis, or the Saite Egyptian priest, he kind of pokes fun at Solon for the naive youthfulness of the Greek myths, right? Solon tells him about the Deucalion flood, which is the Greek version of Noah's flood, right? The Noah's flood myth has an independent ancient Near Eastern version, comes into the base of Greek mythology. It's one of the really old Greek, like Genesis myths, which is essentially the Greek version of the Noah's flood, right? Solon tells the Egyptian guy this, and he's like, that was yesterday, right? He's saying that's like 2 weeks ago compared to the real ancient history. And so here's the point we're making. The real Athens, the Athens of history, it's created after the Deucalion flood. This imaginary Athens, the Athens of antiquity, the one that's fighting with Atlantis, it's created not just before Deucalion flood, so the world-destroying flood, created 3 floods before. You hear me? 3 whole world-destroying floods. So in other words, like the world is created and destroyed 3 times with eons between them, right? From the time that Atlantis stuff happens and the time that the historical Athens happens. And so this means, right, Plato can make the ancient Athens anything he wants. It's a blank slate. That explains all the physical differences. He's describing a completely different place, right? He's describing a place that is geologically impossible. Why is ancient Athens, as Plato describes it, geologically impossible? Because it's been completely obliterated by multiple world-destroying floods before the current Athens is created. So he's presenting he's saying, the Greek myths are from this later infancy of our Greek world, whereas this Egyptian stuff is referring to the real, true ancient Greek stuff. All right. And the other point to make is that the 9,000 year number is used in both Critias and Timaeus to refer to different periods. Critias says that 9,000 years ago was the creation of Athens and Atlantis. The Timaeus says 9,000 years ago was the creation of Athens and Atlantis. In the Critias, they say 9,000 years ago was the destruction of Athens and Atlantis. In the meantime, Atlas's descendants, so Atlas is the first king of Atlantis, his linear descendants rule over Atlantis for many generations. So you have 9,000 years ago as the beginning, 9,000 years ago is the end, and in between 9,000 and 9,000, you have many generations. What does that tell you about the 9,000 number? It's a generic number that means a long, 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 long time ago, galaxy far, 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 far away. That's what Plato says when he says 9,000, 10,000, 8,000 in the context of Egyptian history. Those are just placeholder numbers to mean, way back then. And by the way, Plato is not alone in saying that all these floods, the Atlantis flood, the ancient Near Eastern flood, these floods are different events. This is kind of the standard Greek way of doing it, right? So look at Celsus, who wrote her first comprehensive pagan critique of Christianity. He had some respect for Judaism, but he thought Judaism was kind of a knockoff of Greek religion. He thought Moses was he was aware of things like the Deucalion flood, and so Moses wrote the Noah version, which was because, it's history. So he said, which is accurate enough, that he's not splitting hairs about which one is right, the Greek version or the Hebrew version, but he's saying that Moses saying what he heard that we all know anyway, not original. And the point he's making is that if you only read the literature of one civilization, you think there'd only been one massive destructive event, right? He says, in fact, we know from reading all these different sources, different nations, different people, they talk about different times the earth was flooded, different times the sun burned up the planet, different times it got frozen in a ball of ice, right? So in other words, from the Greek perspective, they don't all have to be the same event. We're not dealing with one apocalypse.
So technically the Greeks would disagree with Graham Hancock and these modern people who are trying to make one unified.
Put it all together and make a single explanation. The Greeks were smart enough to know that doesn't work, that different people experience different events in different places at different times. Kind of elementary. And
let me just go to bat for them for just 1 second and just say, when they're reading these local events, they don't have to ignore the data that is giving a geographic location for where these floods take place. And so it seems that these authors are having to draw the conclusion that these are different events because of the locations in which a lot of these supposed floods take place, correct? I mean, wouldn't that help you?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say exactly how they thought about geography. Their ideas about geography were really different than ours. So I don't want to make any absolute firm conclusions there, but when I get into the section on ancient Near Eastern mythology, which we're going to transition to soon, that is going to point out that a lot of these stories are the same story from the same place originally, right? So we're not actually, most of the flood stories are not actually independent accounts from different places, but rather a single flood story that was so popular that it spread with human migrations, and you can trace, so like the Deucalion flood and Noah's flood are the same original text.
Yeah, but the particular Nile Egyptian flood would be different.
That would be different. Exactly. Yeah. So there are definite, or like a Native American flood myth from like the Minnesota lakes, right? Mm-hmm. There are flood myths in creation stories all around the world, because flooding happens anywhere you try to do agriculture. If you're an agricultural people, then flooding is one of the most destructive things you know. And so any agricultural civilization that has agriculture as the basis for its creation story might have some massive destructive flood as a part of that creation story. And that I agree with in terms of the universalization, or, all around the world. You can't say they're all the same. But in the case of the ones from classical literature, it just so happens that they are the same one. It's the one from Mesopotamia that has traveled with urbanism. As the Mesopotamian city-states, the institution of the Mesopotamian city-state becomes established around the ancient Near East, what happens is the basic Mesopotamian mythology goes with it. And so when Hancock says the story of Manu and the story of Noah are independent accounts affirming a real global flood, they're actually the same account, and they're just being brought by two different Indo-European cousins, right?
Right. Isn't it fair to say they're not technically independent then? They are dependent, at least in some way, being passed along. So it's not at the inception, they come from the same ultimate source.
Exactly. Moving in two different directions on the landscape. Graham Hancock says that the Edfu texts are the lost conclusion to the Plato's Acephalus trilogy, right? The sequel to the Critias is, according to Graham Hancock, carved in hieroglyphs in a Ptolemaic temple in Egypt. That's a temple to the creation, according to the cult of Horus, right? So it's the creation story associated with the god Horus, carved on the wall in Edfu. So, and this has been maintained by these Atlantis people for a long time, that Edfu texts are allegedly the corroboration of the Egyptian source tradition. And the obvious problem with this is, of course, that the temple wasn't begun to be constructed until 100 years after Plato died, right? So there's just a basic impossibility there. But what they maintain is that it's based on a much earlier tradition from the Middle Bronze Age, right? That's the Hancock answer. They say that the texts themselves are new physically, but they are arguing what? That they're a lost earlier Egyptian papyri, right, that have been vanished, and that's the basis. And they claim that, you read this as the final chapter that Plato never got to. And I'm going to explain why that's wrong at the next slide. Again, Flint Dibble has already done this. Go to his Twitter feed from June 20th, and you'll see how he completely debunks Hancock's reading of the Edfu text in Magicians of the Gods. In Magicians of the Gods, 2015, Graham Hancock, he basically cuts and pastes the text into out of order and out of sequence. So by taking snippets from different parts of the Edfu text and arranging them in his chosen cherry-picked chronology, he creates the false impression that they're telling the conclusion to the story of Atlantis. There is no responsible scholar would do that. On top of that, he's not even using the texts themselves. He's often confusing the texts with secondary authors' interpretations of those texts. So he's going to secondary literature where people are talking about the Edfu texts, and he's mixing elements of the Edfu texts with scholars' spin on it. Right? So what you're reading in his book is a mixture of different sources, not purely from the Edfu text. So that's the basic problem. And Flint Dibble nailed it. And so I got the Han shot first, because just like in Star Wars, right? You get the Star Wars fans debating over whether George Lucas is allowed to change the order of events, in Star Wars, or the way continuity errors crop up, right? So you essentially have the Edfu text, the special edition, is the Graham Hancock edition, where he's retconning them to make them fit. He's retroactively fixing their continuity to make them align with the work of Plato. Next slide. So that was posted to after the debate. So after this contentious debate with Graham Hancock on Joe Rogan's podcast, Flint Dibble made those tweets, and Graham Hancock waited a month to respond. A month later, after Flint Dibble basically said, "Come on, Graham, talk to us more about the Edfu texts. Show me what you're thinking here." He called him out. Graham Hancock then says, "Not me." He says, "My friend Manu Sevzadeh." I think Sevzadeh is the right way to pronounce it. So I apologize to Dr. Sevzadeh for the stupid pun. But he saves the day because Dr. Sevzadeh's work, which deals with this German translation of the Edfu text, because Dr. Manu Sevzadeh reads German, right? So he's reading the German, and he claims that Flint Dibble and most other archaeologists confidently say that Plato made the whole thing up. the so-called noble life. I neither speak nor read German, but compelling evidence in the new German translation falsifies that thesis. So he's saying, if someone can just read the German translation, you'll see that Flint Dibble is wrong and Graham Hancock is right. And who is the translator he's citing? They're citing Dieter Kurth, who is the person at the Edfu translation project. He's been the chief translator there since the 80s. So Graham Hancock is misrepresenting this translation as new. Yes, it's becoming complete now. Like the finishing touches on the German translation are still ongoing, but the translation has been published as it's been translated, right? And it's over 40 years, almost 40 years, right? It's not been since the mid 80s that the German version of these texts has been freely available to scholars who read German. And it's really strange for someone to say, although I don't speak German myself, and by the way, I'm not claiming expertise in German, but Graham Hancock saying, now I don't speak German or read German, but my friend does. And based on what my friend says, I'm confident that the noble lie thesis has been disproved. And in fact, Plato never lied. So who is Manu Sebzadeh? Manu Sebzadeh is a dermatologist. Like a lot of Atlantis researchers, he's not an archaeologist or an Egyptologist. He's a hobbyist. He's been studying this stuff since about 2016. He's a Hancock fan, and he is friends with Professor Kurth. He's personal friends with the real translator who's doing the German work. And so he's translating the German into English. Now, any scholar should know that that is already a problem, right? If you're going from a translation language into a translation language, it's like somebody is saying, my friend's translation of the King James from Middle English into Modern English, or from early Modern English into late Modern English, proves the real intent of the Bible author. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
In other words, you should just get someone who reads German to read it in German and not rely on your friend's translation from German into English. That's really problematic. So what he did was he got Manu to write an essay for his website in response, I think, to Flint's critical tweets, right? Flint Dibble wrote the critical tweets. Manu Sebzadeh, sounds like a great guy. I'd love to hang out with him and Professor Kurth. Personally, I think he sounds really cool. It's an interesting writer, but he's making really tendentious arguments about the Edfu texts, which do not prove what Hancock says they do. And just to summarize them really quickly, why do they maintain that they're older than the age they are? Why do they say that these texts go back to Bronze Age originals? They say they go back to Middle Kingdom originals because they're written in Middle Egyptian. So they say Middle Egyptian is the dialect of the Middle Kingdom. These religious texts are written in Middle Egyptian. Therefore, they date to the Middle Kingdom. You see the problem there? Like, what if I were to say the Book of Mormon is written in King James English? Therefore, the Book of Mormon was written by King James. See what that is? Because the Book of Mormon is written
1600s, right?
Right. It's written to sound like the King James Bible by people who read the King James Bible. And so when they wrote the Book of Mormon, they imitated, right, the dialect of early modern English, because that's what the Bible is supposed to sound like. Why was Middle Egyptian used in religious writing in the New Kingdom in the Ptolemaic period? For the same reason Akkadian is used in the Babylonian, in Hammurabi's Babylon. Hammurabi's Babylon writes a dead language, Akkadian, on the pillar. The law code of Hammurabi is written not in a living language, but it's written in an ancient Semitic language related to the modern language, because it's how you convey what? Religious authority. You can write something new, but if you use an old dialect, then it has a much more, an old ring. So in other words, scholars do not believe that something written in Middle Egyptian originates in the Middle Kingdom. They recognize that the reason why the dialect survived in religious writings is because the dialect of the Middle Kingdom was sacred. It was a liturgical language. It's like the way dead language
writing or even speaking in Latin,
right? Or Coptic in Africa, or the way Hebrew was for a long period in European history before it was revitalized and restored to the status of a living language. Dead languages are used for religious texts all the time, and so you cannot make any inference about the content of the Edfu texts based on the dialect that they're written. That is simply false. It also mentions that Horus reigned for 7,000 years. I guess 7,000 is kind of close to 9,000, right? I think 2,000 years is a pretty big gap, personally. But that's just my opinion. So they're saying it's the same date, like same rough dating. No, he says that there are two combatants that fight on a ring-shaped island. Why does he say and remember, a lot of Plato's Atlantis maps show it as a ring-shaped islands. So they say that because it mentions a ring-shaped island, allegedly two battling enemies on a ring-shaped island, that's allegedly the war between Athens and Atlantis on Atlantis. The problem with that is they're saying ring-shaped because the hieroglyphic meaning round is a ring. So it's not ring shaped, it's just round. And what is it? It's like any all the creation story. Horus, various gods are fighting to make land emerge from the primordial ocean. And they're animal spirits, like many animistic cosmogonies, like many ancient animal creation stories, where you have the gods in forms of animals. They're in conflict with each other, and they eventually cause land to emerge and the temple to be built on the land. So the primordial oceans give way to the first island, and on the first island you get the first temple. See? And they're saying this is the battle over the destruction of Atlantis. It's not. It's not. The combatants are gods. They're gods in the form of animals that are fighting over the creation as the creation is happening. He says that the term Atlantis appears in Egyptian hieroglyphs, meaning born of the flood with pristine sites, which is a phrase and we'll get to that in the next slide. He claims that born of the flood with pristine sites is the origination of the term Atlantis. This is wrong, and we'll explain why in a second. And then finally he says, well, in Plato's Atlantis, the god Poseidon, who is Atlas's father, right? Atlas, the first king of Atlantis, is born of Poseidon, and Poseidon carved the laws of Atlantis on a big pillar. So you get the law code of Atlantis carved by the god Poseidon on the pillar. What does the Edfu text say? That text says that the first island grows a reed, a papyrus reed, and that Horus, in the form of a bird, lands on the reed. And he says this is the same story as Poseidon carving the law pillar. Why is this? Does this make any sense to you, Derek?
I mean, there's so many questions I would have, right, that I would follow through.
So let me explain how their logic works. They say papyrus is what you write on. The first temple is originally built out of reeds before it's built out of stone. The reed that Horus the bird lands on is therefore a pillar. The pillar that the bird lands on is the thing they make papyrus out of that they write the laws on. Therefore, a god carving laws into a stone pillar is just like a bird that lands on a piece of grass. That is a really, really, really difficult intuitive leap to make. Doesn't support the notion that this is the lost Hermocrates, right?
Plus there's so many questions I have though, Joseph, like that make me think like, okay, are some of these things just almost ubiquitous in a lot of these civilizations? Because I think of, like you brought up, Hammurabi inscribed laws on stone, and I think of pillars all over Egypt, all over the ancient Mesopotamian region. Like, how coincidental would an overlap of some of this material be in the sense of how they behaved in their
100,
so there's just questions of that, but this seems to be a leap to me.
It would be an interesting coincidence if there was a stone pillar involved, right? But there isn't. Calling a piece of papyrus growing on a wet island where gods are fighting with each other is not the same thing as the multi-generational genealogy of the kings of Atlantis before they wage a Peloponnesian-style war against the virtuous Athenians who defeat them, right? And we don't even know what happens. The gods get angry, right? But where does it end? Zeus is about to take revenge, and then it stops. Right? The lost portion is like, what do the gods do to destroy Atlantis? Nobody knows. Your guess is as good as mine. So anything could be the sequel. Maybe the gods, maybe the Horus stuff is the conclusion. There's no right answer. So I'm not claiming that it's been conclusively disproved, but this essay on Hancock's website doesn't do it for me. I read it with an open mind and I couldn't get there. Next slide. So finally, I want to borrow a phrase from Chrissy Hansen's publication that I like. Chrissy Hansen wrote a publication about the problems with the Roman provenance theory. It's an unrelated subject, Roman provenance. The Roman provenance theorists believe that the New Testament contains a bunch of secret codes of Flavian emperors, right? And that the Flavian emperors invented Christianity and put a bunch of conspiracy codes inside the text of the Bible. And they use a lot of convoluted etymology to say that, St. Peter is actually Arius Piso or something like that. They swap syllables around. So it's pseudo-linguistics. It's not real scholarship, but it's the kind of pseudo-linguistic work that people do to engineer any conclusion they want. With a large enough text, you can go mining for words that might have slightly different meanings, right? So how does he get Atlantis out of the Edfu texts? Manu says that this hieroglyphic sequence, which I've written out here, says born of the flood with pristine sites. So he takes a bunch of obscure linguistic rules from early Greek and Egyptian pronunciation, right? First, he has to swap the 4 characters around. So he moves the second 2 characters in front of the first 2. Then he does a transliteration. Then he converts some consonants to some other consonants using these obscure linguistic rules that he's dug for. And then he swaps out one of them with a Greek substitute, right? And forms a contraction. And eventually at the end of this 4-step process, he gets a single 2 syllables of Atlantis, Atlant, right? He manages to come up with Atlant out of this phrase, which he's snipped apart, rearranged, and done a bunch of like linguistic conversions to get there. And you don't need to do that. Occam's razor says the simplest explanation is always right. Plato did not coin the term Atlantis, right? He's the first person to write the term theology, right? I don't know of any source before Plato that talks about theology, but he says Atlantis. His older contemporary, Hellenicus of Lesbos, has a surviving genealogy of Atlas. So what is Atlantis? Atlantis is the genitive ending of the divine name Atlas, right? Atlas, the guy Atlas, put a genitive ending on it. It's what? Atlantis. So it's just a normal Greek word. And so what is the island or the continent of Atlantis is a contraction. It means of Atlas. And what is it? It's island of Atlas, Atlantis Nessos, right? So you take the actual name, Atlantis Nessos, island of Atlas, and you drop the word island, and it's just Atlantis of Atlas. So the book Atlantis, which is the genealogy of Atlas, predates Plato. So this is he doesn't have to make up the word. He's referring to the fact that the kingdom is under the king, under the authority of Atlas. There's no plausible reason to make a connection to say maybe this Solon read this hieroglyph and saw the word Atlantis there. It's Chrissy Hansen's term etymological frenzy, where somebody is basically on a mission where you start with the conclusion, manufacture evidence in order to support that conclusion. Through linguistics, you have enough pieces in any language. Language is made up of lots of small units of meaning, right? Every syllable, every phoneme, every grapheme, every jot and tittle on the page can have lots of different meanings associated with it. So if you can cherry pick and choose whatever meanings you want for whatever syllables, you can basically make an etymology for anything.
So
like if
the map you have here made of stone, you already have the idea of these rocks need to fit together to make the United States, and now we're going to make it.
That's right. And nobody really cares that Montana is portrayed bigger than Texas here, right? Look, California and Texas are too small and Montana is too big, but it doesn't matter because they kind of sort of fit. Right. And our brains are pattern recognition machines and we can see it. So I'm saying, yes, exactly. This etymology of the word Atlantis, which is attributed to the Edfu texts being touted by Graham Hancock, is just like that map of beach pebbles, which one of my Facebook friends came up with, which is really cool. He did that. He was like out on the beach and he was like, hey, look, took a photo. Look what I did. It's cool. I like it. And so that's why I wanted to use it there. All right. Finally, we've been a little slower than I thought. We still have time. So now we're going to dive into the ancient Near Eastern myths you asked about. So when you were on with Flint, I love that. Flint did such a great job talking to you, and I was really happy. But you asked him a question that he said, yeah, there's an orientalizing period. So ancient Greek period, early classical Greece was a period when you have a lot of ancient Near Eastern cultural influences. And we see that a lot of it in pottery. We see that in early writing. And then you mentioned this. Do you remember this?
Yes.
Why you mentioned this?
No written myth about it. It's only the image.
And the reason why it's only the image is the Argonautica, or the story of Jason and the Argonauts, which is set chronologically in the Bronze Age before the Trojan War, but it's written after the Homer. So it's a textual tradition that's later than Homer, but it's describing mythological events that are earlier than Homer. There's lots of different versions of it. Many versions of the Argonautica exist. They often contradict each other, right? So there's not like a single canonical version. All about which version you choose. The characters can be very different. Good guys can sometimes be bad guys can be good guys. They're not, the motives, like the same events happen because you're dealing with what's likely an old oral tradition. So the way I'm an anthropologist, and a lot of the study of oral literatures, like the mythology and lore of different tribal peoples around the world, you'll have the same plot, but you have a lot of different embroidery around the plot. Like the plot, like the same events happen. Why do they happen? What do they mean, right? If you listen to the Apache version versus the Navajo version of the same myth, right? The Apache perspective is that this good guy did this for this reason. The Navajo perspective is maybe he's an asshole, right? So like the same guy is being portrayed very differently, doing the same thing for different reasons by different tribal groups. The ancient Greeks were the same way. They had lots of different tribes. They were like a bunch of closely related indigenous peoples with their oral traditions. So the surviving written versions of the Argonautica are all over the map in terms of exactly how the plot unfolds. And so this indeed is a depiction of one of the many lost versions. There undoubtedly were texts that had this version in the past. And this is near the scene where Jason defeats the dragon that's guarding the golden fleece. Mm-hmm. And here you see Athena using sacred medicine to probably revive him. And in this one, he's gotten eaten, swallowed by the dragon, and he's being disgorged. And you asked about the connection in ancient Near Eastern mythology between this and Jonah. I had to share with you. I instantly thought of this article, why Jason and the Argonauts and Jonah and the whale may be related. All right, so just some basic stuff about ancient apocalypses. There was a recent ancient apocalypse in the classical period, a relatively recent one, the one that happened before the so-called Dark Ages of the Greeks, right? So classical civilization and the written traditions of the era of Plato and before Plato all are coming out of this like reemergence of Greek literacy, which has got the cultural memory of the late Bronze Age collapse in the rearview mirror. And the late Bronze Age collapse was a geopolitical phenomenon that is amazing. It's a really fascinating topic. It's one we could do an entire episode on sometime, just about the late Bronze Age collapse. But you have the coordinated destruction of urban empires all around the Mediterranean. They all collapse within like decades of each other. You have the end of the Egyptian empire in Canaan. You have the roots of the Hebrews is likely as in the aftermath of this event. The historical Hebrew, Judaism as we know it. But it refers to events that happened before it, like the historical Moses or whatever, or where is Moses placed in history before that collapse? But
and just a fun, interesting thing as a lay person who is an avid researcher in this stuff, I find it fascinating when I read Homer. You got these characters, Odysseus, Trojan War, Moses.
That's part of this.
All of them go pre-collapse of the world, and they always have these themes that happen in the late Bronze Age that are just before this catastrophic civilization drop.
And Troy was part of that. The actual historical destruction of Troy is one of the main events, right? Conflict between the Wilusa or the Ilios people, who are Indo-Europeans of Western Asia Minor, right? And the Mycenaean Greeks. That's the historical Trojan conflict. That is one of the main events, one of the big, massive conflagrations, like destruction of cities that happens then. The other ones are all around the Eastern Mediterranean, right? Lots of the same things happening around through what we call Canaan, right? Northern Canaan was a hotbed of this stuff. The Egyptians versus the Hittites in central Canaan, right? Where you have the Hittites and the Egyptians have one great last chariot battle, and then both empires fail because they've exhausted each other, right? They're at their most powerful extent, then they go boom, and then everyone's done, right?
No wonder earth-shattering myths of apocalypticism happen due to real stuff.
Egypt is never an international superpower again. It never rules over Asia. Parts of Asia. The Hittites go the way of the dinosaurs, right? Their Hittites go extinct. And then we find out that it's even going on in freaking Germany, among tribal peoples in Germany. You go all the way up to the Battle of Tallin's Bridge. You go way, way north, up by the northern part of Germany. And there's a massive infantry battle exactly at the same time as the Trojan War.
Wow.
Like and there's hundreds of bodies in the swamp.
So that was the real World War I.
It was like, it's crazy how many different and it means that that state level society must have been extended that far in what we used to think was very tribal, small scale village economies. We're dealing with the period when Bronze Age urbanism is spreading out into Western Europe. And it's the end of classical civilizations in the Mediterranean, but it's the beginning of classical civilizations in Western Europe, where you have after this, you have the rise of more complex societies in the periphery, right? So it's like a decentralization of what these urban systems and these stories. So the fact is we're dealing with the legacy of that, with the ground zero of urban civilization being the ancient Near East. And then after everything blows up, what happens? All the cats are out of the bag now. And everything that comes in the classical period is picking up the pieces and telling the legacy of that. And yes, you can see it in the Bible. You can see it in classical Greek mythology. They're all putting back the broken pieces together of the same tapestry that blew up at the end of the Bronze Age. Oh, Assyria was the one place that didn't collapse because Assyria had perfected guerrilla warfare. So Assyria was a place they were really good at the new forms of warfare that emerged in the Iron Age. So it's the one civilization in the ancient Near East that had continuity, right? Where it was just chugging along and Assyria just did its thing over the collapse. But everyone else, they were torched. They was like burned. And so there's natural disasters are likely, like there, floods, earthquakes, fires, things like that. They're part of it, but they can't explain the whole thing, right? You can explain maybe why an earthquake hit over here, an earthquake hit over there, but earthquakes don't all happen exactly at the same time. Some people believe it's caused by more like natural causes than man-made causes. I don't. I support human warfare as being the main driving force of the Bronze Age collapse. Why? Because even though you have earthquakes around the Mediterranean, they wouldn't happen in far distant places at the same time. And they don't explain why cities were destroyed where there aren't fault lines, right? Some of these destructions happen places where there don't get earthquakes. Doesn't explain why there's this battlefield in Germany, for crying out loud, right? These are all too many examples. So it's like technology changing around warfare is what's going on. The change in weapons, the change in the way horses and chariots are being used, and the rise in powerful guerrilla warriors, like the mercenaries basically take over, like the Sea Peoples and the Hebrew, the Canaanite bandits, the Hapiru, and the various tribal groups that were like marginalized mercenaries hired by the empires. They rise up and they overthrow the empires. And so you got a massive social inversion. The people who were outsiders become the new bosses, and there's like a period of a few centuries when literacy goes away in the Mediterranean, and then it comes back when the Phoenicians reintroduce it. But all law systems, all legends of ancient destruction of places likely percolate through this context. All right, so just a reminder, and this is something so Indo-European and Semitic are brothers from another mother. They're distinct language families, but their intimacy with each other, their proximity to each other, goes back long before the invention of writing. So Proto-Indo-European, the original Indo-European language, and Proto-Semitic, the original Semitic language, they were neighbors in the vicinity of Mesopotamia. At the time writing was invented, right? So you go north of Mesopotamia, you're in the Proto-Indo-European homeland. You go north and a little bit east of Mesopotamia. You go south and a little bit west of Mesopotamia, right? And you're in the Proto-Semitic homeland. And they were all exchanging like words for animal husbandry, livestock. So they had the same kind of general political economy. Why do they share so many ideas, like attitudes about gender relations? Like there's so many things that are the shared ancient Near Eastern legacy of Indo-European speakers and Semitic speakers. They're not separate. They're really part of the same world before writing was even invented. So we should never, ever think of them as races, right? The way that like modern scientific racism used to say that the Indo-Europeans were racially distinct from Semitic peoples. They're not. They're genetically the same. I mostly come from England and Ireland and Scotland. My ancestors, Irish, English, Scottish, it's all the same thing. So the British Isles, but every one of my British Isles genes, some of them are from the ancient Stone Age in Western Europe, but a ton of my DNA comes from the ancient Near East as a mostly Irish and English person. If I do genetic testing, the origination of my genes that are associated with agriculture, they come from Assyria. Where were the Greeks originally from? Iran, right? The genetic origins of the Greeks are both from the Eurasian steppes and from Mesopotamia. The genetic testing. So that's like all Western Europeans, they come from here, just like the Semitic, Arabs, Jews, and Europeans, they're all ethnically part of that same ancient population. And what we deal with is shifting patterns of multilingualism. And we know this because they have loan words before writing, right? The word for bull in Paleo Hebrew is the same word in Greek and Latin, tor, right? Taurus and tor, Paleo Hebrew roots meaning for livestock terms that are shared with Indo-Europeans prove that these terms were traveling with the livestock throughout the region. When the so-called Orientalizing period, which is this huge ancient Near Eastern input into the base of classical Greek civilization, what's it stimulated by? It's stimulated from two directions. One is from the remnants of the Hittites coming through Asia Minor, which is now part of the Greek, like the western part of Asia Minor is classical Greece. It's part of classical Greece. It had been since before the Trojan War. There were fighting, the Trojan War was people from Anatolia and people from the Aegean fighting over land. It's going on during the Bronze Age. It's going on after the Bronze Age. So we're not dealing with separate planets here. We're dealing with Hittites and Greeks sharing a common legacy. Likewise, the Phoenicians, who are based in Northeast Mediterranean, who are cousins of the Hebrews, they're early, so Aramaic, Phoenician, Paleo-Hebrew, they're all like dialects of the same language. The Phoenicians didn't call themselves Phoenicians. You know that? You know what the Phoenicians called themselves? Before Carthage. The later ones called themselves Carthaginians, but the early Phoenicians would have called themselves Canaanites. They were just the Canaanites that used boats. They were the seafaring, trading Canaanites. So they were and just like the Greeks, the Phoenicians and the Greeks were both involved in the Mediterranean sea empires of the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age. And they were sharing, and what is the early, so after the collapse of those big urban empires, what do you have? You have the merchants of the ocean ruling. So for that, during the Dark Ages and after, you have whoever's plying the Mediterranean in boats and selling stuff, they're the most powerful people. So what are the two main groups doing that at that time all over the Mediterranean? The Phoenicians and the Greeks. Why do the Greeks adopt the Phoenician writing as the new writing system after literacy comes back after the Dark Age, right? So linear B is extinct and now classical Greek gets written because they're borrowing it as it's a trade language, right? It's originally being used by Phoenicians and Greeks to conduct transactions in the Mediterranean economy. And they're really hard to tell apart. So what's the difference between a Phoenician and a Greek? Is whoever rules any given state. Those states have both groups neighboring side by side. And so here's an example, like one of the oldest cool inscriptions. This has got it's a dedication to Apollo. It has Greek text, archaic Greek text written on the votive offerings legs, and it's written in two different directions. So this was before Greek was written left to right, right? You know how Hebrew is right to left, Greek was left to right? Early Greek was written in both directions. It went zigzag. So you would read one direction and then the other, and then one like back and forth like a Z. And they said, this is crazy. And they stopped doing that and they started writing. And so it diverged from Phoenician. That's because they're getting it directly from the Phoenicians.
So technically, just to be on the same page, the Phoenicians or Canaanites,
seafaring Canaanites, or northern Canaan, they helped build they helped build the Temple of David. They were like the ones who brought the cedars of Lebanon to the Temple of David. They were allies of the Jews. Go on.
Right. So these people, just so we're on the same page, they were, I'll say, more successful or had more power than you would say the Greeks at the time.
I would say it's a toss-up. Basically, the entire Mediterranean coast, other than northern Italy, in the early classical period. So northern Italy is where the Etruscans are a major, powerful indigenous European tribe of northern and central Italy. Then you have the early Latins in central Italy. But for most of the Mediterranean coast during the early classical period was either Phoenician territory or Greek territory. So neither one was more powerful than the other. But you notice that all over the place, you have territories where they both share power. So Sicily is half Phoenician, half Greek. Corsica and Sardinia, right? Phoenicians, Greeks, and Etruscans all living together. Cyprus, where the Philistines come from. By the way, the Philistine names are probably etymologically related to Mycenaean Greek names, right? And they have Mycenaean style Greek pottery. So where do the Philistines who settle in southern Canaan come from? Probably from Cyprus. What's Cyprus? Another place where the Phoenicians and the Greeks are intimate. And so what do I see here? These are the first commercially sold glass objects in the history of the world. These are amphoriscoses. They're little perfume flasks, core molded perfume flasks. I teach my students how these are made in a glass blowing lab on campus at the University of Massachusetts, where we have a master glass blower who helps to replicate some of these early technologies. But look at the difference. So one of those is considered Greek and one of them is considered Phoenician. Can you tell the difference? Those little flasks?
They're so close. It's hard. As far as the actual glass, no. And I'm looking at the language too and kind of seeing overlap at least to some degree too.
The two technologies are called Greek or Phoenician based on where they're found. There's no physical, like if you found that outside of an archaeological excavation, you wouldn't know. You could say could be Greek or Phoenician because the same technology is used by both because they're both involved in the invention and exchange of these objects, right? And so we're not dealing with separate worlds. We're dealing with a Greco-Phoenician trade empire where the Greco part is emphasized in the northern Mediterranean and the Phoenician part is emphasized in the southern Mediterranean parts of the Iberian Peninsula, right? But everywhere you have both groups together, not really enemies. And what are they? So these are the people who were successful at profiting from the New World Order after the Bronze Age. These are like the most successful economic powers in the Mediterranean for centuries. And it's why this ancient Near Eastern culture is so prominently expressed in the early Greek stuff, right?
So real quick on the map on the top left, I just need to be on the same page. That turquoise color is those are kind of shared territories amongst both Phoenicians and the Greeks, correct?
Okay, so it's the top one shows the areas of Greek trade colonies.
Okay.
So the Greek expansion is the top map.
Got it.
With the purple being their core territory and the turquoise being their colonies.
Okay.
Trade colonies. The bottom one is the same map, but showing the Phoenicians who are coming out of what's now Israel, right? Modern Israel is their source, and they leave modern Israel and they become the same kind of trade superpower colonizers of Mediterranean coast. They are in different territory than the Greeks, but the entire, other than the Etruscan part of northern Italy, the entire Mediterranean is either one or the other, and they're all doing the same thing. And so why do they use the same alphabet? Because how do you conduct business? You have to have a common like trade language, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's the reason why the Western alphabet becomes the alphabets we know, the phonetic alphabets of Europe originate as a result of the Phoenician donation to the Greeks of this useful trade language at a time when they were selling the same commodities. Right, these high value commodities.
You real quick on the languages being so similar. Is this just a trade language, or is it safe to say both languages we're looking at in the bottom left and the top right? Because you know how today we have like, hey, we all speak a specific language that we can universally understand, but they had private language, particularly in their own regions, that they have completely distinct.
You'd have to have an expert who's better versed in that material to answer that question. I'm not going to be able to say for sure, but what I'll say is it began, the first use of this form of Greek is likely in the context of merchant activities, because record keeping for sales and things like that, like economic demand is why writing gets invented in a lot of places. Like why does cuneiform gets invented? Because they're tabulating debts. They're saying how many bales of wheat we're allocating. What are your food rations, Mr. Peasant? We have to make notations of your food rations. So that's writing. The origin of writing in the ancient Near East, the origin of writing is fundamentally about transactions. And then it later gets used to tell stories, right? So once you have this transaction system established, then you can say, now we have writing and we can do, but like Linear B does not have a lot of mythology. Like we have the text of ancient Mycenaean civilization, some of it, but it's a lot of record keeping. It's a lot of like bureaucratic bullshit, right? Why do we not have a ton of...
And according to Joshua Bowen, the earliest stuff, like you said, all right, we're sending them 7 sheep and they started out like having them in clay balls that they had to break open. They had ways to try and keep from theft, but yeah, it was all transactional due to some economic or even dealing with trade or selling stuff.
And then they started doing things like inscribing votive offerings. Like I'm making an offering to this god and I'm going to write my little message to the god, please favor me, Apollo. I write it on there. And so there's really archaic forms of Greek that are like that. So it moves out of the economic context into the religious context. And eventually, how does mythology get transmitted there? Through Indo-European poetry. The like Homeric hexameter is oral traditions which are based on stock phrases, rhyming ways where we have all the heroes have distinctive ways of being named and fitting into rhyming poetry. So you can memorize it, right? And so how does the tradition go through the Dark Ages? Bards, singers, like with their little lutes, they would go and they'd go to the court and they would recite this long epic poem that they have memorized that they've learned from so-and-so and learned from so-and-so. This is the way the Indo-European mythologies get transmitted before writing, right? This is why Hindu and Greek mythology are so similar, because both India and Greeks were Indo-Europeans who had epic poetry told by bards using this sort of primitive Indo-European poetic musical style. And so once you have writing, then what do? Now you don't have to have the bards remembering it all. You can take Homer comes along and he takes the hexameter, which is this ancient stories that go back to the Bronze Age, and they get written down by Homer after, at the beginning of classical civilization in Greece, and that represents a turning the page. Now you have a literary mythology rather than one that's based entirely on memory. Oh, and ship designs too. Biremes. The Phoenicians designed the boats we think of as Greek, right? So there's lots of both cultural, mythological, and technological connections between early classical Greece and the other major trade power, which is based in the area around Tyre and Cyprus, right? Northeast Mediterranean islands and the coast of Asia Minor, shared territory, ground zero for this cultural development. Long story short, this is what I'm saying. Greek mythology and Semitic mythology, just like the Greek, there's no Semitic race. You know, Eurasians are Eurasians are Eurasians. To be from Eurasia means you're Eurasian. There's no like place where one kind of Eurasian stops and a different Eurasian begins. The entirety of humanity is one big blob, right? And in the case of the myths that we associated with the Bible peoples, with the Canaanites, with the Sumerians, Hittites, the Greeks, the Romans, they all are drawing water from the same damn well.
May I just make one question / comment here at this point? Because I am not going crazy. Yes, there may be some connections at times where there is a bit of what people will term parallelomania. I am not just pulling crap out of my you-know-what. But I would say that in some of the stuff I've done in the past, I may have made some statements about parallels that someone might have taken and said, that's parallelomania. You can't make that genetic leap unless you have stronger data or evidence to prove it. But I'm not fishing in a pond that there isn't the trout I'm looking for, meaning this is from a rich heritage where they are interconnected, communicating. Who came first, the chicken or the egg? Doesn't matter at the end of the day. My point is, if it walks like a myth, talks like a myth, and it has the mythic elements that you find over here, and then you find it over here, they might have a shared ancient root. They might have genetic connections. Who knows? And who cares? But I'm trying to nail down mythology as mythology. And so if I'm wrong about a genetic connection, forgive me for the unforgivable sin.
Oh my God.
I'm saying there's something rooted here, though, that they are connected somehow.
I'm so glad you said that. And this is why I'm fascinated with this. I am really, you know me enough. I'm interested in controversial ideas. I'm not somebody who adheres to some dogmatic orthodoxy. And I find why I don't like Hancock's take is that he accuses real archaeologists like me of being like hidebound dogmatic opponents of crazy ideas. We're not. We just are evidence-based. We want evidence. And I think once you have evidence, if you want to speculate a little bit, if you want to take actual evidence and use that to construct a crazy theory, go for it. We want to publish you. Like real journals will publish far out ideas. And I'm somebody who has no problem staking a claim that some other scholar will say that's bullshit. I've been called a pseudo-archaeologist before for some of my kinds of arguments. Like going earlier in my career, I was a little bit more wild and woolly 20 years ago when I was first started publishing. But yeah, I've had people say, what is this crap? I am open to being persuaded by people who are trying to argue for fantastic, crazy ideas. They haven't persuaded me yet.
I'm not even trying to say these are fantastic. Some of the stuff I'm doing, someone might take in a more, they've been trained to think a certain way for so long. I don't even think what I'm doing is so fantastic. I would just say it is pushing the boundaries where you just discussed 7th, 8th century, the cohesion of the world between Phoenicians and Greeks. I'm just simply pushing the time to say, if they've been talking back there, that communication, I think, still happened into the Hellenistic period. That's all I'm saying.
You and I are on the same page there. Absolutely. It's not like things, if anything, they become more integrated. Like the world becomes smaller over time, not bigger. Right? The world, like things come together that were spread apart, right? And so we forget sometimes the original connections, but later on, and they didn't always match up right. Like they might have taken two related deities and thought they were separate. Or they took two deities that were unrelated and thought they were the same. They say, your sun god and my sun god are the same sun god, even if they were actually different sun gods. Or they'd say, your Indo-European god and my Indo-European god are actually the same gods, but we think they're different gods. This happens all the time. It's like ancients weren't super careful and they weren't doing it out of some desire for historical accuracy. They weren't trying to tell the truth about history. They were trying to tell their own myths in the way that mattered to them, and that meant whatever it meant for them at that whatever time, right?
There's how Plutarch and these guys will say Osiris is Dionysus, right? Well, exactly. They may have been completely distinct deities from different regions, and eventually the myths coalesced to kind of have this torn apart Dionysus mythology that may be really old, but when did that, I'm curious to know, like, when did that story of Dionysus being torn apart by the Titans originate? Because it has a lot of similarities to Osiris being torn apart. Who told what to who and influenced myths to have that?
And if you look at enough of it, you see the same plot elements are all over the place. Lots of the mythic stories get transferred between individuals. There's like a lot of Thracian mythology, for example. If you go to ancient Thrace, it wasn't written down. It was mainly conveyed through art, right? It was on the periphery of the Greek world. So Thracian art, then it is read by so many people in so many different ways. The same Thracian hero can be read as like any number of different Greek gods, depending on where in Greece the art is being looked at. Does that make sense? Yep. And so when you deal with text and material culture side by side, they're constantly, it's like DNA in the primordial soup. That's like recombining all the time. And yes, so you deal with which snippet came from where is the $1 million question. And this is where you go out on a limb and eventually people say, I don't believe you, but I'm okay with that. Just to reiterate the point, the Greeks and the Hittites, who are the major Bronze Age imperial power of Asia Minor, both grafted earlier generations of Mesopotamian gods onto their Indo-European pantheons. So the original Indo-Europeans were small-scale tribal people of the steppes and Asia Minor, right, around the Caucasus Mountains. So the Russian steppes, the Iranian steppes. So these are the arid grassland hearth of Eurasian, North Central Asia and parts of Southern Europe and Iran. This is where the original Indo-European tribal civilizations were. When they then got influenced by the urban empires of Mesopotamia, they took the Mesopotamian gods and they plugged them into their ancient tribal belief systems. See what I'm saying? So they're like grafting the Mesopotamian tree onto the Indo-European rootstock. Does that make sense? And you get like a hybrid plant. And so you've heard the rank Raglan hero, you've talked a lot about Jesus mythicism. Why do anthropologists like me not take that seriously? Why is it considered to be a really outmoded and obsolete form of mythological analysis? Otto Rank was a psychoanalyst and he was looking for human universals. He was seeing these heroes as all coming from this universal archetype, kind of like Jung or whatever. Like it was a psychoanalytical theories of Greek mythology and other mythology was the biggest thing in the world back then. Everyone thought about it in psychoanalytical terms. Most of the heroes he talked about in his book, The Myth of the Birth of the Hero, where he compares like the heroic birth narratives, most of them were actually just different versions of the same damn ancient Near Eastern thing over and over again. So he's not dealing with independent data sets. He's contaminated his sample, right, with a lot of very closely related groups.
I feel like Hancock is trying to not take that approach. He's trying to say, he's reversing or taking the opposite of what you and me are suggesting, that there is a dependence of how this stuff happens, except he's going and saying there is a dependence, except it was this pre-Ice Age thing. And so the communication, rather than taking Jung's position where it's just almost like it's all psychological and anyone anywhere on the planet would have come up with
the survivors of Atlantis spread the story.
Exactly.
That's
he's breaking away from the psychoanalyst position, but also then having to explain, how do these people way over here figure it out? Well, this guy who had just had fair skin traveled this boat with his intelligence to teach these little tribal people who didn't know anything.
So good example is the ancient Near Eastern flood myth, which we said Ziusudra is the original Sumerian one. It's handed down, and we know that there's direct textual dependence. The flood of Noah has got word for word Semitic language text, right? Like when it talks about the days and nights on the water, right? The linguistic nuance of the Noah flood story is directly dependent on the Sumerian and Akkadian, various Mesopotamian languages that were original. Likewise, the story of Manu and Yama, same thing, right? And how do we know that all three, that the Deucalion flood, which is Prometheus's son, who is the Greek Noah, right? The Greek version of the story, the Hindu version of the story, and the Hebrew version of the story. How do we know that they're all not related to each other? It's not like one is copying, it's not like the Greeks are copying Noah or the Hindus are copying the Greeks. None of them are doing that. They're all getting it from the earlier ancient Near Eastern source. And we know this because they share details with the earlier ones they don't share with each other, right? Like, for example, both Deucalion and Manu Hebrew, create humans themselves. They're not just biologically reproducing, right? They just like, you know how God breathes life into dirt, right? To make humans in the Hebrew version. In the Greek version and in the Hindu version, the survivors of the flood are endowed with divine power to make humans from scratch. They don't just make them the old-fashioned way, the way they do in the Hebrew account. See what I'm saying? Yeah. So those are two different strands of an Indo-European tradition that's distinct from the Hebrew. You know what I mean? So the differences matter as much as the similarities. Differences show how...
I was reading Ovid's Metamorphosis, and that's later, of course, but they throw rocks over their shoulders and the rocks turn into humans?
Because the rocks are Mother Earth, right?
Okay.
Gaia is the rock. What's the creative principle behind humanity? We're all the children of Mother Earth. So throwing the rocks over their shoulders remakes the dead human race. In the case of Yama, it's miraculously out of the water. But again, you're dealing with the one human couple. Yes, they are a couple and they do biologically reproduce. They do have offspring the old-fashioned way, but that they don't explain the rest of us as a product of incest, right? They solve the incest problem by giving them divine powers to create humans by themselves. Well, of course, the gods are doing it through them, but you know what I'm saying? It's not like they become like long-lived immortal. So in other words, there's clear evidence that these are originally just different adaptations of an earlier source that we have now found in Mesopotamian archives, right? We have found a lot of the Sumerian and Akkadian precursor texts. So again, these are all the same story. Another example is the division of the primordial human halves. Have you ever heard a Jewish scholar talk about the way Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are read together, where you have male and female created simultaneously in Genesis 1, and then you have not Adam's rib, that's a bad translation. Adam's side, Adam's half is divided to make Eve, right? So you have the original human that's androgynous, combining male and female attributes, and then they're separated, and the first man and the first woman are each other's other half, my better half, my other half. And that we as married people who have sexual relations with our spouses, you and I are both in that category, right? We complete our primordial union. Like we restore the union of the flesh, that is the marital bedchamber is where the recoupling of the original androgynous union is made, right? And so you can see this in Christian iconography of the Adam and Eve story. And so let's just talk about the Greek and Hindu versions. In India, the Brahman Atman, so in the Upanishads, so this is again 7th, 6th century BC. And by the way, Indian writing is also distantly related to Aramaic because Aramaics were in northern Iran, the Indo-Iranian, so Persia and India. The written tradition of India is connected to Mesopotamia through that Indo-Iranian borderland in, between Farsi and Hindi, right? And so you have the primordial man who, just like Adam and Eve, just like God creating Adam and Eve, and Adam is lonely. Adam is lonely. So what does God do? God takes him and splits him in half. So now he's got a companion, a woman to keep him company. Likewise, in the Hindu version, the creator God is lonely. He has a profound sense of loneliness. What does he do? He takes a piece of his God self, the Brahman Atman or the God soul. He divides it into two pieces. He splits the male from the female. Ancient Indian genealogies, they would say that your male ancestors are your solar ancestors and your female ancestors are your lunar ancestors. And they all trace back to this primordial first man and first woman.
Kind of reminds me, just one comment about I know that some scholars have pointed out in ancient Israel, we have these artifacts that show a mother goddess with two born god sons, and one is the lunar, one is the solar. And literally the etymology in the name Jerusalem, Salem was one of those deities. So this roots back into ancient Canaan, like you talked about, and there might be overlap way back then in some way.
And then, so getting back to Plato, you have in his Symposium, he explains it, because remember, the ancient Greeks were really into same-sex sex. They were, there was like male romanticism was like very, very solidly normative within Greek mythology. So they explained it as that the primordial, in Plato's Symposium, Aristophanes is telling Socrates about the creation. He's saying that these original human were androgynous, combined male-female things, and they were too dangerous. They were going to attack the gods. Zeus chopped them in half. So you, again, sort of like in the Hebrew version where you have a fall, like a divine punishment aspect, and as a way of keeping the humans in check. Like their power is they're no longer these really powerful four-legged creatures that can physically challenge the gods' authorities. They are now two-legged creatures that are desperately searching for their other half. In this version, some of them are male-male, some of them are female-female. And so if your soulmate is a member of your same gender, it means you're descended from one of the male-male combined units that was separated. If your soulmate is or female-female, right? Whereas heteronormative marriage is between people who are descended from the male-female androgenes that were cleft in half. It's like they healed up the wounds, and now we're desperate to find our other half, our soulmate, and reunite.
Yeah, this is where that idea comes from.
Another really good example is the baby in a basket floating down the river raised by enemies or animals. Romulus and Remus, Moses, Karna in Hinduism, Telephus, the son of Hercules in Greek mythology, and the one historical person, Sargon of Akkad, the first empire in the Bronze Age, the first successful trans-regional urban empire in human history. The founder, by the way, Moses' biography is based on probably several different historical individuals. Sargon of Akkad is one of them, right? When they wrote the biography of Moses, they're borrowing from earlier literary traditions, and one of them is the Akkadian traditions about King Sargon the Great, who was the first Akkadian dynasty. So he is the guy who in this period was commonly said as he was discovered in the bulrushes in a basket, raised, and then later became the ruler, just like Romulus and Remus, just like Moses. So I know what I want to say. Remember Camel and Chrissy's fantastic talk? It was marred by technical difficulties, so your viewers might have gotten frustrated because it had so many problems with the mics, but it was really cool where they're talking about the rank Raglan hero, and they pointed out that there's a really sharp 10th century BCE cutoff, with the ones that are younger than that being historical figures, and the ones that are older than the 10th century BCE, so second millennium and earlier, being what? Mythological creatures. Right. I want to validate what they're saying. What their conclusion conforms to my own impression of the data, independently kind of had that impression. I'll say that, remember what was the one exception? Do you remember the one exception? Romulus. And I'm here to say that Romulus, the earliest accounts of Romulus, he's placed at the Bronze Age collapse, right? It's the Romulus who's set at the foundation of the first of the kings. He's the first king of Rome, right at the beginning of the monarchical period. That story is a later version of the origin of Romulus. But the earliest ones, which are recorded in Greek sources and a few others, which are centuries, a little bit older than that. I don't have them all at my fingertips right now. Right. But they talked about the descendants of Romulus being survivors of the Trojan War. So again, we're dealing with what is the thing that happens before and after the 10th century? What I've been talking about, the Bronze Age collapse. 1200 BCE, everything goes blank, right? Radio silence. 400 years later, which is after that 10th century cutoff, right? Now we're in classical literary history. And now, so the historical figures that are born in the Iron Age and later tend to be mythologized real people, whereas the people who are from that legendary Bronze Age, which is the distant memory before the Dark Age, they tend to be historicized mythological people, right? Where you take the myths and you give them historical characteristics. Whereas the later stuff, you take the history and you give it mythological characters. So they're both blends of history and myth, but the proportion of history to myth shifts radically depending on whether you're dealing with, less than 3,000 years ago versus more than 3,000 years ago.
Real quick question about Karna, because I don't know as much about Indian mythology or even a lot of the Indo-European side. You know the scholarship on this real well. Karna, the narratives we find, I've heard a lecture in passing and didn't hear the whole thing. I can't remember the academic's name that said these Mesopotamian narratives, or even like we're talking about Sargon of Akkad, a lot of these narratives did find their way into the stories in India. Is that what we're seeing here with Karna? Yeah, because again, the Indo-Iranian branch of Indo-European has a foot in northern India and a foot in Mesopotamian world. So there is an indigenous Indian urban empire called the Indus Valley Civilization, which is solidly Bronze Age, but we haven't deciphered their script. And because we can't read, just like we can't read Linear A from the Minoan Crete, right? Linear A and Indus Valley Civilization are two examples of Bronze Age urban empires whose writing is unknown to us. How do we figure that? Do you think we'll ever figure it out?
Unfortunately, the problem with Indus Valley is the texts aren't long enough, right? The texts we have are too short. And so we need to find some lost repository of bigger samples, right? Mm-hmm. The longest text in IVC script is like would fit on a note card. So really small snippets. Mm-hmm. But there is probably, even at IVC level, there's probably some evidence of Mesopotamian influence going all the way back then. And why is that? Because they put their large public buildings there, so-called citadels or temples. That's kind of the wrong term because we don't know exactly what they were used for. But they have large public buildings that are in like the northwest quadrant of the city, which is the same urban scheme that you see in Mesopotamia. So they're independent, they're unique. They invent fired bricks. They have a lot of ways that the Indus Valley civilization is distinct from Mesopotamia, just like China is distinct. So we're not saying that it's identical, but there's a few little hints, right, of small connections between them. Another one is cylinder seals. You know how Mesopotamia uses these little cylinder seals? You see those also in the IVC text, right? That's what a lot of our surviving IVC script is in the form of cylinder seals. So the fact that you have a few of these, but yes, so that earlier period, that's pre-Indo-European. They're probably related to the Dravidians or somebody. They're not Indo-Europeans at that stage. The later Indo-European migrations into northern India, they're bringing the ancient Near Eastern stuff. Absolutely. So here's another proto-Indo-European thing that goes around the ancient Mediterranean, and that is the slaying of the Hydra by the storm god. And in Jason and the Argonauts, they combine the dragon with the Hydra that we're familiar with from Hercules, right? But so I use that clip from the 60s movie there just to illustrate the Hydra. In that case, he's fighting Jason. But remember, the dragon in the Jason story really only has one head. So here's a really interesting thing that goes back to that linguistic confusion before writing. Proto-Semitic and Proto-Indo-European both had stories about a guy named Yam who gets slayed. But the word Yam in Semitic means sea and is referring to Leviathan or sea monster. Yam in Indo-European means twin and is referring to a brother that's murdered by a brother. So both of these are stories about the murder or the annihilation of Yam at the beginning of time. One of them is a seven-headed serpent, and one of them is a virtuous twin brother. And so what's likely happening back in Proto-Indo-European timeframes is even before writing, you had some linguistic confusion where you got these kinds of narrative elements being swapped across language boundaries and misinterpreted. But both Semitic versions and Indo-European versions of both stories exist. Of course, Cain and Abel, Romulus and Remus, Thor and the ice giant. So the virtuous brother who's slain by the evil brother, Manu and Yama in Hinduism, right? These are all that same. There's a Proto-Indo-European myth of the brother killing the brother, and the Proto-Indo-European myth of the slaying of the Hydra, which we see also in Semitic mythology. So which came first, because they both have both myths, both Semitic and Indo-Europeans both have both myths. Which is the donor and which is the recipient? Which was the original Yam and which is the misinterpreted copy? Who knows? Because it's before writing, right? It would have been when people were just telling campfire stories and mishearing stuff. And so, there's the beast from Revelation, which is, again, got the seven heads like the Hydra of Hercules, or the Leviathan that's crushed by Yahweh. Okay, so this is just that Yam. So the Proto-Indo-European Aimus, that's a reconstructed Proto-Indo-European root word, and it's Ymir, the ice giant in Norse mythology. It's Remus in Latin. It's Yima, who ends the ice age in Zoroastrian mythology, and it's Yama, the lord of death in Hindu mythology. So Yama is slain by Manu, Yima is killed, and the ice age ends. Oh, by the way, the flood becomes an ice age in some versions, right? So Yima and Yama are both Noah-like characters. They both have a lot associated, like Yama and Manu are brothers, and there's sometimes one is the Noah guy, and sometimes the other one is the Noah guy in the oldest Indo-Iranian cultural traditions. It's hard to tell which one was the more important of the two brothers. But Yima is like the Zoroastrian Noah, but he doesn't survive a flood. He survives an ice age. Why is that? Because in the Iranian steppes, floods were ridiculous. We're dealing with herding people. Migrating herders who live with like goats are not worried about floods. They're not doing floodplain agriculture. They're a different political economy. What are they worried about? They're worried about harsh winters. So that's why the same story of the flood gets transformed into a story of an ice age, right? And you see that in Norse mythology and you see that in Zoroastrianism. Because Yama and Manu are like Adam and Noah rolled into one. Does that make sense? They combine the characteristics of Adam and Noah. There's a lot of conflation between the Adam story and the Noah story.
Right.
That's the thing you're talking about. Because remember, what did I say? Where did the ancient Greek myths come from? From the Syro-Phoenician and Hittite connections?
Yep.
Syro-Phoenicians and the Hittites had it. The Greeks got it from them. So here you have Hercules and or Yahweh, whichever one you want to call it. You know, he's either an avatar of Zeus, the king of heaven, or he is the king of heaven, depending on your choice.
Wow.
7 heads. And the hero with the spear. Okay, and you see a little Ankh there, which is like Egyptian. So yeah, this is really, really cool. And it comes from just the right time. The age is exactly 2,800 years old, exactly around the time the Greeks are inventing writing or adapting Phoenician writing. So we talk about Hemerism, right? Which you've heard of from Richard Carey and others, where you take myths and you set them in history. The Greeks love to do that. So they took Proto-Indo-European myths and they set them in historical time. So like a story about Zeus becomes a story about Zeus's human kid, right? And so Hercules is doing things that are part of ancient Proto-Indo-European mythology, but he's doing them in the historical narrative of Bronze Age Greece. So Hercules is no longer a god from the beginning of time. Hercules is now a dude who was hanging around with the other warrior dudes before the Trojan War, right? He's a real person. And so I mentioned 2 of his labors that have clear Proto-Indo-European parallels. One is slaying of the Hydra, and the other labor is where he cleans the muddy stables. You know this? Where he reroutes the river, blasts water. What's that?
Poopy stables.
Stables. That's right. They're full of shit. And he blocks off the river and causes it and breaks down the wall. So he busts open the stables, frees all the horses and the cows, and washes out their poop with a giant water blaster. So now we'll go to the Hindu version to show that this is actually Proto-Indo-European. So in the Hindu creation stories, which there are lots of them, Hinduism has lots of different creation stories. There's not like one version. There's like many, many creation stories in Hindu. So Jupiter or Diospiter is the original name of Indra, Zeus Piter, right? Father Zeus, and the name of Indra, who's the king of heaven in Hinduism, one of the oldest Hindu gods, is the same Indo-European deity as Zeus and Jupiter and Jove in Latin. And what does he do? So just like his kid in the Greek version, Zeus slays the Hydra, Vitra, who's got 3 heads in this version. He slays him, and in the process of slaying him, he causes a global drought. He traps all the horses, cows, and all the oceans, all the water of the earth, he traps in a subterranean stables. So there's like this underground stable where all the horses and cows are trapped. Indra slays Vitra and bursts them open, blasts the water out, and the powers of creation. So horses and cows are viewed metaphysically, not as literal animals, but as primordial energies of creation. So the waters of creation are like horses and like cows that the evil serpent monster Hydra thing was trapping in the earth and keeping the earth dry and desert. So you see, so this is one of the oldest, is that Proto-Indo-European myth of the slaying of the Hydra is directly connected with the cleaning out of the imprisoned horses and cows in a massive stable. So so the Greeks took what was a really ancient story about the creation of the universe, and they told it like it happened in their homeland with people they were related to.
Right.
Just the same way that the Romans took the primordial hero twins and made them the first kings of their urban, their city. Like Romulus was a real guy. He wasn't just the guy who killed the first mortal. He wasn't just the guy who killed Aemus, like when Manu slew Yama in Hinduism. And the storm god makes it all the way to Shintoism in Japan. Indigenous Japanese mythology, which is likely borrowed from Old Korean. So medieval Koreans were connected to the Eurasian steppes. So the medieval blacksmithing cultures of the medieval Korea, so Old Korean language, these would have been people who through Mongolia and West Central Asia, the mythology of ancient Near East made it all the way through the herding cultures of Eurasia. So the arid grassland corridor that goes all the way from Manchuria to Germany is a place where herding people who migrate, those Iranians with their cows and horses, right? They go all the way back and forth. It's like, why does wheat show up in China thousands of years ago? Why does rice show up in West Asia and Europe thousands of years ago? It's because people were moving back and forth, right? Actual human beings going back into the early Bronze Age, even before writing, were traveling as far away as China and Europe from the same source location. So that's why Susanoo, by the way, it coincidentally sounds like Zeus, but it isn't probably Zeus. Susanoo is like a Korean word meaning weather control shaman. It's an old Korean word, but he's a very important Shinto god who again slays the 8-headed water serpent and is a very important and is like central to Shinto mythology. And in Central Asian Buddhism, Indra, remember when we said Indra has the same biography as Hercules? He did the same deeds, and he's also the mace wielder, so he's got the club. So when Buddhism spread through the Greek-speaking world into Central Asia, they recognize Indra, who's a protector of the Buddha. He's a Hindu god who's the king of heaven. He serves Buddha. He says, I'm now a disciple of the Buddha. So Indra becomes like a major Buddhist guardian. His iconography gets combined with Hercules. This was a case, we talked about how gods get combined and recombined. It was the case where ancient Indians and ancient Greeks recognized that the stories about Indra and the stories about Hercules were the same stories. And they recognized that the iconography was the same guy. Naked guy with a club, right? Naked guy holding a club is the way that the Greeks made bronzes of Hercules. It instantly gets transformed into the Buddhist interpretation of Indra. So the Buddhists take the iconography of Hercules, and again, you see it all the way in Japan. So when you see a Japanese Buddhist temple guardian, you're seeing a form of Hercules mediated through Indra.
Wow.
Of Indra, who then becomes a protector, because remember, the Buddha is super good. He's pure peace and good. You need to have some really powerful badasses to protect him from the evil dark forces that are opposed to him. So you need to have somebody who's physically more powerful than the most powerful demon. You elect Indra, the king of heaven, the thunderbolt wielder, who's got like all the powers of Zeus and Hercules rolled into one. And you even see Hercules still being venerated in medieval Christian Europe. They're the newest publication. This is another brand new publication, that the Cern Giant. Have you ever heard of the Cern Giant? It's in southern England.
No.
I think in Dorset, So very southern England, right near the coast, there is a monument. You know how Graham Hancock is into these giant earthworks?
Yeah.
Giant earthwork. It's a giant portrait of a grotesque Hercules. The grotesque Hercules is Hercules with an erection, right? And you can see statues from the same period in England where Hercules with his manhood emphasizing, right, holding a club. And it's like you have to see it from the air. And the fact that this was made in the British countryside at a time after Christianity was well established. So people were still into Hercules in the medieval period in England. So again, just to remind you, the Jason and the Argonauts movie from the 60s, which is a reinterpret, like they're all reinterpretations. There's so many different versions, but they pulled the Hydra from Hercules and made it the dragon. So now we're finally getting to the Jason and the Argonaut stuff we talked about at the beginning of the section. I got to recommend a really cool article from the 90s in the journal Judaism by Gildas Hamel. He argues that the Book of Jonah, which is now widely regarded as a kind of a parody or a farce, so Jonah is a satirical book, right? It's written as satire, not as deadpan, like serious. It's got animals wearing clothing. Jonah plays a deadpan bad prophet he's a good prophet, but he makes all these comical mistakes, and God has to like chastise him for being such a stubborn fool, right? So it's rather well accepted today among many scholars that Jonah has a satirical intent. According to Gildas Hamel, what is being satirized? What is it a parody of? It's a parody of Jason and the Argonauts. The story of Jonah and the whale is a farcical send-up of the Argonautica, of likely a lost version of the Argonautica, or one of the oral traditions, one of the spoken versions of the Argonautica that was being told in the Eastern Mediterranean in those integrated Greco-Phoenician contexts, where you have Greeks, Mycenaean Greeks, and later classical Greeks, and their oral traditions are merging together with people in greater Canaanite contexts. And so the Israelites who are like constantly mocking and making fun of the Assyrians, the Egyptians, and the Greeks, right? Like the Assyrians, the Egyptians, and the Greeks in the Bible are not good guys. They're often the butt of the narrative. Well, in this case, what they're doing, they're inverting a lot of the themes in the Argonautica. So like the way the sailors behave, and the way that the different, and they're all stories. They're stories about a guy who goes on a long journey around the Mediterranean, goes all the way across the Mediterranean and back in a boat. And according to this argument, the dragon that guards the golden fleece in the gourd tree is not partially the fish that swallows him, but it's really being parodied by the tiny worm. Right? So this dragon in the Argonautica becomes what? An inchworm that eats the entire shade plant that's keeping Jonah from getting sunburned, as he's sitting there complaining about what a jerk God has been to him, right? And then so God like grows the plant, it keeps him, he's like, oh, what a nice plant. And he's like, and then God sends the worm to eat the plant. so that now he's like, oh, its sun is so hot. This is terrible. God, why'd you do that? And it's like, because he decided to go sit there in the middle of the desert. God miraculously covers him with a gourd tree. And then he's like, so this is a farce. And yes, the versions of the Argonautica that show the disgorging of Jason are maybe closer to the particular version that was being parodied by our Hebrew author. And you look at the oldest depictions of Jonah in Christian art, in the Jonah sarcophagus, the same damn sea serpent. Look at the sea serpent disgorging Jonah in the Jonah sarcophagus. So this is very early Christian art. Late 3rd century is before most Christian art exists. And you have Jonah. Look at the details on the sea monster. So there's Jason being barfed out by the serpent and Jonah being barfed out by the so-called whale, which is really a fish or a serpent. You see the teeth, right? See the gills, see the scales on its neck, see the wrinkles in its nose. See the folds of flesh around its eyes, right? The iconographic traditions are clearly related, as is the gourd plant, right? The fact that Jason in the Argonauts, the golden fleece that's being guarded by the dragon, is in a gourd tree, just like the gourd that is shading Jason. So, and Jason and the Greek form of Jonah are anagrams, right? So the Greek form of the name of Jason is a anagram, and it means dove, and there may be doves involved in some versions of the Jason's narrative. So if Jason and the Argonauts is Star Wars, then the Book of Jonah is Spaceballs. It's like the Mel Brooks version of Jason and the Argonauts. That would be my, continued reference to science fiction here. But you should go. Not everyone will be convinced by Hamill's article. It's certainly controversial. It hasn't made everyone change their mind about this. But I had to show this because you asked about that art picture. What is the connection there? It has been proposed. And this was recognized by ancient art historians at the Vatican, right? Not like 100 years ago, Vatican art historians were like, oh yeah, clearly the artists that made the Jonah sarcophagus were inspired by the Greek depictions of Jason, right? They recognized that the two art forms were related, but what Gildas Hamil has done has been to make a further argument that the texts, not just the images, not just the pictures, but also the stories are related, with one being a mockery of the kinds of virtuous behaviors that you see the sailors and other characters in the Argonautica doing. So this is before Sargon of Akkad. You had the original organized religions on Earth. You had the first massive temples at the time, the invention of writing, right? And you see the cults of gods like An and Lil and Inanna, who becomes Ishtar. These are all established very, very early in ancient Near Eastern civilization. So these are some of the oldest gods in ancient Near Eastern mythology. And they go back to the very, very, very beginning. What happens? The city-states that are in lower Mesopotamia, they get transplanted into upper Mesopotamia. They go from southern part down by the mouth of the rivers, you go all the way up into the mountains, and you get basically copies of Mesopotamian city-states and the transplantation of the cults. And the ancient temples of the south become new modern copies in the northern cities that are like the daughter cities of the Sumerian original states, right? So the first ziggurat was like a Tel or a Tepe or what they call a Shan in China or a Hoyuk in Turkish, right? What are these? Why are these all places called mountains or hills? Because ancient Bronze Age sites that go back to the Neolithic period, the Stone Age, and are continuously occupied by villagers, they get built up over time. So your town transforms into a hill because archaeology is throwing away trash, right? It's all the stuff we drop. And it's like, why is the Tower of Jericho underground? The great Neolithic citadel or, observation tower at Jericho is buried practically all the way to the top, right? Because it goes back to the Neolithic and it's been continuously occupied, and sediment and dirt has all fallen down. So the first ziggurat was not built as a ziggurat. The first ziggurat, which is the temple to An, who was the Mesopotamian sky god, the temple to An was built as a little temple, and then over 1,000 years of use, right, of rebuilding, it grew into a ziggurat. So it's an organically grown temple. The later ziggurats are copies of that, where they built it purpose-built it. So they built these monuments, to imitate the ones that naturally grew over thousands of years. They made later copies that were built like purpose-built because we're doing a copy of a Mesopotamian-style city-state in another region. Does that make sense? So the first real empire, so you had like confederations in the Sumerian heartland, but the first real empire where you have like foreign tyrannical powers coming in, conquering, ruling over you is the Akkadians, who established established the first Semitic-speaking dynasty in the region, Sargon of Akkad and his successor states. And it's where you get Mesopotamian influence first in what becomes the Hittite, the roots of Hittite civilization, which are Indo-European speakers in Asia Minor. The roots of urban civilization in Cyprus all go back really, really early. So the region we're talking about, which is the shared region where the Greeks and the Phoenicians are all getting their stuff from, it's the place where the Akkadians were influential, like among the very earliest spread of ancient Near Eastern civilization into the Mediterranean coast. So the Akkadians and the Neo-Babylonians are shown here, just their chronology. And there's different like short, low, and middle and high chronologies. So you got to be careful with the dates. They don't always line up because different scholars use different dating schemes and they vary by 150 or 200 years. So don't take the dates too seriously, with high precision here. But the point is that the Akkadians, they come along, they last a few generations, then they get overthrown by the Gutians, who are hill people. They're like illiterate tribal folks from the hills. And in that period, after the Akkadians collapse, the Akkadians are the first people to write Semitic languages, right? So they have a language that's distantly related to Hebrew. They're writing their laws in it. The Gutians come along, they destroy the late Akkadians, and then you have the Neo-Sumerian period where the Sumerians come back. But what you have is a long period where Sumerian as a language, which is not Semitic, right? Sumerian is a non-Semitic early language of the Bronze Age. It declines. And so by the Old Babylonian period, where you have Hammurabi, right, famously, you have the return of Semitic languages as the dominant forms. And where Sumerian by that point, so this is later in the Bronze Age, Sumerian is now pretty much a religious language, and that's it, right? So it was originally the main vernacular language of Mesopotamia. And then by the later period, when the Babylonians are in power, it's still used in like magic and religious formulas in the context of temples, but it's not a spoken language. There aren't like Sumerian people who speak Sumerian in their house anymore, right? So this is just another example of how old languages survive as religious languages. And so here's the famous portrait of maybe Sargon of Akkad or maybe his grandson. Somebody didn't like it. They destroyed the eyes. They poked it with a spear at some point in the past because the eyes have the power, right? The deified king can see you through the eyes of the statue. So somebody has taken out some severe anger on Sargon's face here. So here is Naram Sin's victory stele, showing him defeating his enemies. He's winning a war. He's got a horned helmet, which symbolizes his divinity. So he's being divinized possibly during life, which is a little bit scandalous. From classical history, going down through ancient Near Eastern civilizations, it's okay to make a king into a god. You can turn a king into a god only after they are dead. You got me? Mm-hmm. King dies, then you make him a god. But he's being portrayed with these divine horns on his helmet. The horns are symbols of divinity. And he's portrayed as a giant trampling on little enemies. And he's also called God of Akkad, King of Sumer, King of the four corners of the world, King of the universe, all that. So he is one of the first examples of an empire, of an emperor that gets elevated into the pantheon. He becomes not just a human, he's a successor of Sargon who becomes like portrayed as a divine being. And he's where people get the idea of the Anunnaki. So going back to the strange beliefs like Zecharia Sitchin and Pseudo-Sumeriology, where it's really bad translations of Sumerian. They say he's like an astronaut or a giant, right? And he's being portrayed as like a 9-foot tall human. He's killing all these people, trampling over them. And so this is a real source. These depictions of kings as giants and their enemies as small people is where we get a lot of bull crap about ancient giants from. But it's really just a way of depicting a king's power, a king's like personal power. So this is like the source of this really important arc motif. Moving on. So again, another blog I love to shout out, Spencer McDaniel's blog, Tales of Times Forgotten. Wonderful blog. She's got a great post. No, Xerxes was not an 8-foot tall giant, where she debunks the depiction in the movie The 300 of Xerxes as this giant. Xerxes is depicted as a giant because that's how you depicted emperors. Kings and emperors were depicted as giants. And so you see this in like Egyptian art. Here's Ramses destroying the sea peoples or the Libyans or the Canaanites or whoever Ramses II is trampling over. You see the little tiny people. You also see the use of horns to show divinity, right? There's Moses with his horns, right? So the horned helmet as a symbol of divine authority and the giant stature of kings is transmitted all the way down through ancient Near Eastern art. Got Alexander the Great with his horns there. Originally, Marcus Aurelius was trampling on little barbarians. The little barbarians are now lost. Right? Nobody thinks Marcus Aurelius was an 8-foot giant or a 10-foot Goliath, right? You have Xerxes there, of course. And you even have Jesus depicted this way. There's Jesus in the triumphal entry on the left-hand side on Palm Sunday. Look at the tiny people below the donkey's feet. Those are the peasants that are laying leaves, the palm leaves and olive branches under the ass's feet as he's entering Jerusalem. Why are the apostles shown full size and the peasants shown small size? The size in the art indicates not physical size in reality like ancient giants. The size simply communicates social status. Jesus and his apostles are large because they have high status. The peasants who are putting the leaves on the ground are small because they have low status. And then we even see that Esherdon. I saw that I went to Harvard a couple weeks ago and I saw a replica Esherdon stela. That's from the third intermediate period. So after the Bronze Age collapse, when you show the Syrian king big and his captured pharaoh, the Kushite pharaoh, is small, right? So in Ramses, it's the Asians who are tiny and the Egyptians who are giants. In the Assyrian version, it's the Assyrians who are giants and the Egyptians who are the tiny babies. See what I'm saying? So you can't make any inferences about the physical size of the people being depicted. That's the point I'm making. That these are just, it's an art historical way of showing power, political power, divine power, horns on your helmet, and big size relative to other people. So now we're going to get to the Clash of the Titans. So that was all just a way of saying, where do the Greeks get the notion of the Clash of the Titans? You asked about Titans ripping people apart, the wars between the different generations of the gods, casting the old gods down into the earth, burying them in. Why do gods that are associated with heaven end up associated with the underworld, right? Gods that used to rule in the sky get defeated and buried underground, and now they're underground gods. These themes happen over and over again in ancient Near Eastern mythology. It likely is echoing the actual historical demise of Akkadians, the real Akkadian powers, right? So like we have this famous curse stone, the Curse of Akkad, the Eker Revenge. The legendary account says that Nimr Sin, grandson of Sargon of Akkad, went and sacked the temple of Enlil. So Enlil is like El in, like he's related to a bunch of the other Canaanite gods, right? There's the different pantheons of the ancient Near East. They all kind of overlap. So Enlil from Nippur is one of these really early Sumerian gods. His temple gets, according to legend, it gets sacked by Namr Sin, remember, who had divinized himself. He saw himself as the god, and he goes and he does that. So what happens? Ishtar, or Inanna, I should say, and her buddies, she does Avengers, assemble. She gets all her god buddies together, and they go and they destroy Naram Sin, and they destroy Akkad, and Akkad is still lost. We don't know where Akkad is. We think it's somewhere in lower Mesopotamia. We're kind of sure approximately where it is. We don't know. Maybe we found it, but we don't have the name attached to the city, right? This Akkad, the first urban empire, is based in a lost city that was annihilated in an act of divine vengeance. See what I mean? The gods are taking revenge on an usurper, a human political who is usurping divine authority, and Akkad turns into a wasteland where the water is bad and no one can live.
Sounds almost like Atlantis.
Right. It does. It has a little bit of echoing of that. It's not in the same Mediterranean context, but it's a story of a city getting destroyed by divine wrath.
Kind of like Sodom and Gomorrah, kind of like these different. Anyway, you get the point.
It happens over and over. Humans do things wrong. And so here we go. The original Greek theogony, the one that Plato hated. Remember how Plato hated the earlier myths that had the gods behaving awfully? Where did they come from? They came from the Hittites. We found Hittite originals of the stuff that Hesiod was writing about in his theogony in Greece. The Hittite originals, they do not have, it's not Zeus and Uranus, and instead it's Enlil and Anu or An, right? So the same story that we find in the Greek version is told in the Mesopotamian version that we find in the Hittites, and it's referring directly back to the events of the early and middle Bronze Age wars, right? So these conflicts over these particular temples, they're getting told as stories of conflicts between generations of the gods. So what happens eventually is Enlil's cult ends and gets replaced by future generations, right? And so Kronos or Saturn doesn't have any like cults associated with them, because the story of the rise of Zeus to supremacy is the story of the line sign of the supremacy of Uranus and Saturn, his ancestors, right? So the earlier generations of the god are no longer in power. So what they would say is, in the Hittite context, is that Enlilship is transferred, right? The authority and office that was previously Enlil's is now Marduk's. So think of King of Heaven as an office, and the office holder can get cast down, buried in the earth, and replaced by the new guy. Remember how I said the Indo-Europeans took their tribal mythology and grafted the Mesopotamian backstory? They gave it an expanded universe. They said, we have our god of heaven is named Zeus. What do? They plugged Zeus into a genealogy that included all the earlier Mesopotamian gods before Zeus. So those older gods from the urban empires become Zeus's ancestor, even though Zeus is the only god of the heaven that the Indo-Europeans had, right? They're taking their little mythology and they're plugging it in like a side quest on a bigger mythological, much older mythological narrative. So that's a picture of Enlil. So Enlil is Kronos. He is Saturn, right? The god Saturn is Enlil. They're literally the same guy. They're just one is through the Hittite version that's coming direct from Mesopotamia. So Enlil becomes Saturn, and Uranus and Anu becomes Uranus, right? The root is still there. So again, so what do you have? You have the original god of the Mesopotamian heaven, An. So it's his sister Ki, the mother Earth. So An and Ki combine, and and their kids, their generations include Enlil or Kumarbi, Canaanite El, Zeus, which Zeus is the Hittite cognate word with Zeus, who is the son of Enlil, right? Or Teshub, or the Canaanite Baal. Marduk is also like one of these Baal Bel gods, right? So you have the Babylonian successors to the cult of Anu and Enlil, right, are Marduk. And likewise, you have Anu, Uranus, which means heaven in Greek. It's a Proto-Indo-European root word for heaven, but it also means a Greek masculine ending attached to the word Anu, right? So the word Uranus is a direct relic of the first god ever worshipped in a large temple in history, right? Down in Lower Mesopotamia, way back in the early Bronze Age. That name, Anu, is the grandfather of Zeus in Greek mythology. And likewise, Maaka, Gaia, right? So they're not brother and sister. Now they're mother and son in the Greek version, but it's still incestuous, right? And there's still the basic story, the basic plot is very much the same thing, with resulting in, this conflict and the throwing down of the earlier generations of divine powers they're bearing in the earth. And so you see, their Saturn eating his children and all that story, right? The basic of Hesiod's theogony. This is what Plato said was so awful. This is the stuff that he said, we shouldn't tell children this stuff. Plato thought it was bad. He thought it was true. He thought these things actually happened, but he didn't think it was good to teach children about, right? That was kind of like Plato's view. So there you can see that Saturn or Enlil is still being used as a symbol of political authority in Western European castle architecture in the early modern period. James V of Scotland, right? He carves a picture of the star sign Saturn, the god Saturn, in his otherwise Christian architecture in his Scottish castle. So think about that. This guy, Saturn, that you see in a 1500s monumental architecture in Scotland is a version of the oldest god ever worshipped in Mesopotamia. And of course, so what is the word giant? Giant is the same as Anunnaki. The Anunnaki are the children of Anu and Ki. What does giant mean in Greek? Giant are the children of Ga. Who's Ga? Greek Ga, Mesopotamian Ki, Ga, Gaia, Ki, right? The Earth Mother. Mother Earth is the mother of the giants. And so the Gigantomachy, which is the battle between the winged giants, who what happens to them? They get defeated by the gods who rule in Olympus. They get cast down from the heavens. They land on the earth and they're buried. Their physical remains are buried under the mountains. Who are the Anunnaki in Mesopotamian mythology? One of the most famous ones, again, is Ishtar or Inanna. She is this winged warrior princess, right, of heaven. She's one of the important Anunnaki. The term is used for a lot of different deities throughout Mesopotamian history, but they start off as heavenly deities, and eventually they become deities associated with the underworld as they lose their status in the hierarchy of the polytheistic system. They get cast down. So again, this is just me reiterating that Plato, what is he doing when he's writing Atlantis? He's making a new creation story. He's saying all those old creation stories are bad for children. And Socrates, who's Plato's badass authority on everything, everything. Socrates says, the way Uranus did what Hesiod said he did to Kronos and then took his revenge, he said, even if these things are true, don't teach them to people. Bury them in silence. The whole story of Atlantis and everything is about how humans are the bad guys and the gods are the good guys. The beginning of the premise of Atlantis is that the entire world is being divided fairly by the gods. The gods are getting along with each other. They're not fighting wars with each other. Gods are good with other gods. They say, here, you're in charge of this over here. You're in charge of this over there. We're all going to be getting along peacefully. We're setting up the primal order for humankind. All the humans have to do is follow our lead and everything is great. And what do the humans do in the Atlantis story? They mess it all up, right? The humans get out of control. The humans take too much. The humans do too much. And the humans suffer the consequences of their own actions. And so Plato has a very different theological perspective than the traditional Greek one that comes from before Plato. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so some scholars have argued that he's reweaving the creation story of Atlantis of Athens in Timaeus-Critias by placing an earlier creation of Atlantis. He's taking the normal one, which is coming out of these clashes, these ancient divine battles from Hesiod that go back to the ancient Near Eastern stuff. That's the original story of Athens' origin. So what's the point of the Atlantis story? It's to establish a new, better origin story for Athens that can be the story that we celebrate Athens' origin coming from this time of heroic triumph 10,000 years ago, right? Does that make sense? He's a revisionist. He's a mythological revisionist who is completely rewriting. He's setting it 3 floods before Deucalion. He's going back, before the ancient Near Eastern flood myth by a long shot. So recapping, Athens in Timaeus-Critias is an analogy for the ideal city-state in the Republic. Atlantis is an analogy for the corrupt Athenian Empire's oppression of Greater Greece during the Peloponnesian War, and leading ultimately to the downfall of Athenian democracy. Plato, through Socrates, favors myths which portray divine virtue, whether or not the myths are actually true, whether the real gods are actually virtuous, right? So maybe the gods are awful entities, but if they are, we ignore that. We bury that in silence, and we emphasize divine virtue as a model for good human behavior. And ultimately, he blames evil empires, like in Star Wars, right? Evil empires he blames for the flawed results of human action. You can see it's part of a kind of a period in Greek historiography. If you're familiar with Thucydides, he's doing like realpolitik. What are they doing? They're saying, wow, everyone always thinks it's about whether the gods like us or not. But maybe it's because we're just idiots. Maybe it's just because we're doing things wrong, right? And we're creating our own problems. And maybe it's not actually the gods' fault, right? So Plato is kind of part of a trend in this period of classical Greek thought. So Atlantis, though, is taken for granted as a real place throughout early modern history. The discovery of the New World was seen by many going back to Francisco López de Gomorra in 1552. The discovery of the Americas was seen as the proof of Plato's Atlantis. And this was we consider this the mainstream scholarly consensus for a period, right? An early modern period. You could see the rise of this important perspective because you had to explain America using classical literature. The Greeks knew everything, right? The Renaissance was about going back and finding the lost wisdom of the ancient Greeks and applying it to the world as we know it. So when you find a continent you didn't even know existed and it's west of the Pillars of Hercules, just like Plato said, right? Boom. So we're living in Atlantis, you and me, Derek, according to early modern historiography. Again, my friend Jason Colavito points out that Gomorra's Atlantis theory would lay the bedrock for virtually every Atlantis and lost civilization theory that would follow, from Ignatius Donnelly to Graham Hancock. All would follow the same arguments using essentially the same core of evidence. So this is what I'm saying. When Graham Hancock says he wants to advance a new idea, he is not. Graham Hancock is advocating for a very, very old idea that we only got out from under after the 18th century, right? People started seeing these myths for what they were in the last 200 years, not before that. right? So he's advocating a return to a very traditional paradigm. And then modern Atlantis becomes important in early science, believe it or not. It's because of Atlantis theory that the first proposal of continental drift is made, which is accurate, right? We know that the continental drift from Pangaea, like the supercontinent that broke up into the land masses of the Earth as we know it, we know that happened tens and hundreds of millions of years ago, before humans even evolved. But they didn't know the time scales. They said, oh, well, how do you get Atlantis so far away? Atlantis must have been closer to Greece when the war happened, and then there's this catastrophe, and what really happened is the whole continent moved, right? And they looked and said, look, the whole world fits together like puzzle pieces. So they recognized the accurate continental drift, and they used the myth of Atlantis as a way of explaining continental drift. And in fact, a naturalist, Alexander von Humboldt, who's a personal hero of mine, he was a great early scientist, one of the early naturalists who kind of synthesized a lot of important developments in natural sciences and social sciences in the 18th and 19th century. He also proposed a form of continental drift inspired by Atlantis, right? So Atlantis does contribute something of merit to the real science, right, in history. And of course, and Flint Dibble already mentioned that Francis Bacon's work of fiction, a novel, A New Atlantis, a work unfinished, which is just like Plato, an unfinished story of Atlantis. It's where we get the notion that Atlantis is technologically superior, right? He invents that. It's a great civilization according to Plato, but it isn't like, they don't have like high technology. That comes from this work of fiction. And then, of course, you have the famous liberal politician from the 19th century, Ignatius Donnelly, who writes The Antediluvian World. And he's the guy who says Atlantis is destroyed by Noah's flood. So even though I said the ancient Near Eastern flood and the flood that destroyed Atlantis are explicitly different floods in Plato, it's because of Donnelly, right, that the two floods become the same flood. And that's the same idea that carries forward today in like the work of Graham Hancock and other people who are like modern Atlantis researchers. They always think of Atlantis and Noah as the same thing.
Hey, just so that we're on the same page too, though, like the idea of them being flooded in Atlantis, would you say that this is nodding to the ancient Near Eastern floods?
Well, yeah, like I said, but the ancient Near Eastern floods are brought up jokingly by Plato when he has Solon bragging to Sonchis, the Egyptian priest, about the antiquity of the Greek flood myth. And the Egyptian priest going, that was like last Tuesday, man. He's like, let me tell you about some real things, right? There's some real early stories. And later on, they say that it was the third flood before that flood, right? See what I mean? So yes, it's the same idea of a world destroying, an apocalyptic flood, a cataclysmic flood. That part is the same, but historically they couldn't be more separated, right? There's like eons separating them in the chronology established by Plato, but they get rolled together into a single event by modern researchers who are trying to cobble together something that seems plausible historically, right? They're trying to make it work in real history and not mythology, which I'm saying this is definitely mythology. Next. And then the racist part of Atlantis theory comes in the 19th century. So the genocide of Native Americans was ongoing throughout the 19th century. There were places like in California, it was really bad. Humans were being hunted, right? Like vermin, like by ranchers all over the West. And there were, so like literally you can see the Native American genocide as leading to the Nazi genocide in some ways, because the legal precedents created by the United States, which was an industrial superpower in the late 19th century, the legal precedents for annihilating inferior races by whatever means necessary, clearing the land and restoring by divine authority, manifest destiny, taking over the land from undeserving inferior peoples. That is directly inspiring to the genocidal actions of industrial states in the 20th century, right? Hitler was not acting in a vacuum. He didn't murder millions of Jews. Like, it wasn't the first time someone murdered millions of people based on a racist ideology. He was following in a tradition that was established by the United States of America in the period after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, right? We're talking about the period when we were allegedly a pro-human rights democracy and we're murdering civilians in large numbers all across the country that becomes our nation. So I'm not saying that because I'm not a patriotic American. I believe in the value of our democracy. hypocrisy, but I have to call a spade and tell you the real horrible actions. And the way that Atlantis myth works with this is because the Atlanteans are white people. America is the land of the white Atlanteans in antiquity. They built the giant monuments. So anytime you see like a giant structure built by Native Americans in the ancient past, thousands of year old mound builder structures, castles in the Southwest, you name it, you say, these Native Americans weren't capable of doing that. They're racially inferior. They couldn't build large things. Never mind that some of them were still doing it in the Southeast, like the Mississippi Valley. There were still mounds being built at the time of contact in some parts of the Mississippi Valley, but that's not the way white people saw it. White people saw those as the products of an ancient lost race. And what's the white civilization's job to do? To recapture the territory that was originally held by the white Atlantean ancestors. And so
this makes its way directly into Mormon mythology about this whole.
Right. Yeah. But to be fair, I'm not going to attack Mormonism here. Mormonism was just a product of its time.
Of course.
All the ancient history that Mormons are taking for granted is because that was popular history at the time of the origin of Mormons. So it is wrong to single it out as a particular.
I'm just mentioning it as one piece of evidence along with this thrust of idea you're discussing.
Yeah.
It has the timestamp on it, and I would say expiration date, but you can see it as a product, like you said, along with this thrust of evidence that Europeans are superior, and there's a lot of ideology that's mixed into this.
So again, I'm going to shout out to Jason Colavito, great blog, great author. He's written a lot of really important books on pseudo-archaeology and pseudo-history. This is a really good one, The Lost White Race of the Mound Builders and the Toxic. And so this is one of the ways that scientific racism rears its ugly head in the 19th century in association with ideas about Atlantis. And in the same period, as a result of these scientific researches, you end up getting two Atlantises. You get a new Atlantis that's proposed by scientists in the 19th century, late 19th century, same period we're talking about. So we talk about Donnelly in 1882 and his view about Atlantis, which comes out of sets the standard. Donnelly is sort of like the major Atlantis scholar of that era. Around the same time, people are noticing fossil lemurs in parts of Asia that are vastly separated from each other, right? They say, wow, we got fossil lemurs. See, lemurs are prosimians. They're primitive primates. They're like they're ancestral, they're stem primates, closer to the branching point that apes and monkeys and different primates come off of. So lemurs and lorises, these are prosimians. They found 19th century scholars are finding fossils of them in really vastly separated places. And they say, how did this happen? So they say, let's propose a lost continent in the Indian Ocean to get from Madagascar to different parts of Asia, right? And they say, we'll call this Lemuria. So now you don't just have one Atlantis anymore. Beginning in the late 19th century, you get Atlantis and Lemuria are both considered scientifically credible. They're both mainstream science at the time sees both as potentially real places in the ancient past. And so now you have not just one, but two lost continents. And this is important because both of these lost continents figure in the Atlantis literature after this point. It's not just Atlanteans. Now you have two lost races, right? Atlanteans and Lemurians. And so both of them play different roles in the way things move after this. Ironically, why do those fossil lemurs exist there? Because of continental drift, right? So continental drift, which was ironically a product of the Atlantis researchers, we said, it disproves Lemuria. There's no Lemuria. Lemuria never existed. It's not necessary anymore because we recognize other mechanisms to explain the existence of those fossils of the same creatures on different continents. You understand? So the key, why do these different continents matter? Because scientific racism in the late 19th century was being led by people who believed in something called polygenesis. Have you ever heard of theories of polygenesis before, Derek?
I have heard that polygenesis, or this idea that each race was created differently, like there's different races of people that were created.
Right. Separate creations for Black people, white people, Asians, Native Americans, right? Different races were created separately, and it can either be due through divine creation. So like early polygenists would say that the Garden of Eden, real humans, like in the Bible, come from the old world, and humans that are created by the devil, right, come from the new world, that kind of idea. Like Native Americans are of the devil. They're not part of the history of the rest of humanity. So that's like a supernatural supernatural version of polygenesis. The scientific one would say, oh, they evolved from different monkeys, right? So the scientific racism would say that like American monkeys give you, or American apes give you Native Americans, Asian apes give you Asians, African apes give you see what I'm saying? And so the notion that, and so why is Atlantis and Lemuria so important? Because these are the sites of these polygenesis theories, right? So where's the ancestor of the Asians evolve, or the Southeast Asians, or whatever, Southern Indians or something? They're evolved in Lemuria. Where do the ancestors of white Aryans evolve? In Atlantis. See what I mean? So and this goes right into Nazi anthropology. The Nazi ideology in the 20th century, they sent primatologists and researchers to South American jungles to look for proof that the mud races or the inferior peoples evolved from separate monkey species in Central American jungles, right? This was part of their scientific efforts in the 30s. And it's all related to the idea of these separate primordial continents where the different races come from. So yeah, so that's the irony. That's why scientific racism and modern Atlantis worship are inextricable, because Atlantis became popular at the right moment in our history. Like ancient Atlantis believers were not racists, right? There's nothing racist about Plato in his ideas about Atlantis. He wasn't saying that they were an inferior or superior people, right? All that gets read into the text in this period when people are projecting their own ideas about the superiority of the white race, right? And they're projecting it onto ancient history. And here we get into Western esotericism, mysticism, and what eventually gives rise to the worst forms of Nazi atrocities that's associated. So have you heard of Madame Helena Blavatsky, the founder of the movement called Theosophy? Theosophy is a syncretistic modern cult religious movement, neo-pagan philosophy, which combines the religious traditions of all the cultures of the world. And she regarded her teachings, her secret doctrines, as being channeled psychically from ancient Atlantis. So she uses her psychic powers, which she claims to have, to listen to the ancient ghosts of the Atlanteans, and they tell her all about ancient Atlantis. And Theosophy is the religion of the Atlanteans. So she is restoring the original, authentic religion of ancient Atlantis. She's starting with works like Ignatius Donnelly, and she is explicitly arguing that Atlantis is where the Aryans evolved. And by Aryans, we now say Proto-Indo-Europeans, but she means racially defined white Europeans, right? She says they evolved in Atlantis. They were technologically superior, like Francis Bacon said, but they burned themselves out with overusing their psychic powers. They were so psychically gifted, their flame just burned too hot, and it caused their, that's why the gods destroyed them or whatever. It's like, that's why Atlantis failed. But they gave us all of our wonderful Aryan culture, and they are now talking through me to you. Oh, and this is the first time that the Atlanteans are really treated as heroes, right? Remember, in Plato, Atlantis is the villain. So the ancient view was the Atlanteans were not good guys. But with Blavatsky, they become the boss. They become like, it's because of her that we think of them as these amazing, conquering, awesome guys like Aquaman.
So technically you have, again, Plato is reinventing the wheel, making the humans evil when the gods tend to have been that role. And now you have a reversal again of this particular mythology happening.
Exactly.
Wow.
Okay, so unfortunately, this right-wing I don't mean right. I don't want to get into basic politics. I'm, pretty middle of the road politically. I have no problem with right-wing in general. So I'm really talking about far right-wing and the left of that. So when we talk about the right wing and the left wing of Theosophy, the left wing is kind of in the middle, and the right wing is way, way off the deep end of the political spectrum. I'm talking about like early fascism and real political extremism that happens to be aligned with the political right. But I'm not like disparaging people for being conservatives here. I just want to make that clear. But so early Theosophy wasn't politically monolithic, but it gave rise quite early to a very, very far right proto-fascist wing, right? So in other words, the Western occult mystical movement in early 20th century Europe was aligned with, remember, political Christianity in the 19th and early 20th century was center left. Like most of the religion and social politics that was associated with traditional Christianity at the time of the abolitionist movement, right? These were people who were like pro ending slavery. They wanted to treat Native Americans like human beings. So political Christianity tended to be center left in this period. And so right-wing paganism and occult teachings were rejecting a lot of the sort of more socially progressive values of traditional Christianity. And they were staking ground way way, way far off the right-wing deep end. And so I want to emphasize that not all theosophists were like that. One of the most important exceptions is the famous Rudolf Steiner. And he's associated with early Waldorf education. He's associated with early biodynamic agriculture. And when I tell you that I know about Atlantis stuff from left-wing hippies, right? I come from left-wing pseudo-archaeology proponents. I know a lot of them in my family, not right-wingers at all. This is in the period after the 1960s when a lot of these ideas are rediscovered by people who are more politically left-wing. But if you go before World War I and before World War II, the center of gravity in this neo-pagan movement was not on the political left, right? It was very much. And so Rudolf Steiner, he was somebody who was targeted by Hitler. He broke away with the main group of theosophists because they found a messiah in India, a little kid in India they thought was Maitreya, the new Buddha. And you can see their symbol, which combines all these different religious symbols. See the symbol? It's got the Tau cross, the sacred circle, the Ankh, the Star of David, the swastika, which is considered that by them to be an ancient Aryan religious symbol. So it's not the Nazi swastika exactly there. The Nazis took it later, right? The Nazis drew it out of this movement. They weren't the ones who put it there, if that makes sense. And then there's the Om, which comes from Hinduism. So what theosophy is, all the different ancient Indo-European religions and ancient Near Eastern religions rolled into one, right? And so Rudolf Steiner, he breaks with the main group of theosophists because they believed in a messiah kid from India that he didn't believe, the future Buddha Maitreya guy. And so he founded a group called Anthroposophy. Now, Anthroposophy is like the sort of moderate wing of theosophy. And as a result of the fact that he was tolerant of Judaism, he was attacked by Hitler. Hitler tried to kind of eliminate that wing of the theosophists. Unfortunately, after he died in 1925, his movement was taken over by the Nazis, right? So that mainstream center-left wing of European theosophy in the interwar period goes away as his widow and others who were close to him capitulate. So they basically say, oh, we're good Aryans, right? We're not Jews. We're not going to tolerate Jews. So the Jews got thrown under the bus, if that makes sense. I don't want to say all early theosophy was anti-Semitic. It wasn't. There were some non-anti-Semitic strands of early theosophy. But by the middle 20th century, theosophy, the right wing of theosophy in particular, Western esoteric cult mysticism is strongly connected to anti-Semitic ideology and to the things that ultimately lead to the Holocaust. And you can see really good scholarship about this coming out over the last few decades. Goodrich Clark's classic book, The Occult Roots of Nazism, Heather Pringle's great book, The Master Plan, about Heinrich Himmler's anthropology wing, which was an archaeology wing and geology wing, the SS Ahnenerbe, which was co-founded with the Dutch prehistorian Herman Wirth. And Wirth was a proponent of the notion of Atlantis in Iceland, so Northern European Arctic Atlantis, where he believed writing was invented by the Finns. So he believed the oldest writing on Earth, which was an Indo-European writing system invented by the Dutch. So he believed that Germanic people invented writing and civilization in Atlantis, located in the North Atlantic, right? And spread culture and civilization out of Northern Europe into the rest of the world. So all advanced civilization is German, according to this view. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Like the Germans are the root race for all of evolved humanity, ignoring those other races that evolved separately and are inferior, right? And so that you can see how this ideology directly informs the dehumanization that results in the Holocaust and the murder of millions of non-Aryan peoples. Oh yeah, he thought Atlantis was 2 million years old. So now we're going to get into some of the social media controversy today. So a brand new piece I'm going to shout out again. So Stephanie Halmhofer is a PhD student who works on this topic. She's got a new chapter in a new edited volume on conspiracy theories and extremism in the present. And she's looking at the way that Atlantis mythology is connected to far-right extremist movements in the late 20th century and down to the present, right? So it doesn't end after World War II. It continues in forms after World War II. And this caused Atlantis proponents to go nuts. So I'm going to talk about Jimmy Corsetti or Bright Insight. I'm not going to single out any small channels here because I don't want to punch down. So this is a much bigger channel than yours. He has 1.6 million YouTube subscribers, and he's a proponent of Atlantis in the Sahara, I think. And he and others like him take deep offense to people pointing out the historical association between the Nazis and Atlantis teachings, right? Even it's a real historical connection between Western occult mysticism, the political far right, and the genocidal efforts of the Nazis. And so he's deeply offended, and he says she's got a PhD. She doesn't yet. She's a PhD student. And he says that mainstream academia has been corrupted to its core. So in their conspiracy theory, we're the bad guys. I'm like one of these evil, conniving archaeologists who's using my credentials, using my PhD to keep Atlantis suppressed. And I'm doing it by falsely calling them racists when they cannot have there's no racism associated with it. So again, not every Atlantis proponent is racist. There's tons of people who believe in Atlantis who are not Nazis, and that is fine. And I have no problem. I have no wish to censor people who believe in Atlantis for whatever reason they do. But when you connect ideologically to the roots of white supremacy and Holocaust stuff, and you don't acknowledge those connections, or when you put on blindfolds and pretend like they don't exist, that's bad. So I'm going to highlight, along with Jimmy Corsetti, who, by the way, I don't think Jimmy Corsetti is deliberately racist, or at least I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt, and I think he's naive. I think he's not as bright as his bright insight handle suggests. And so therefore, I think part of it is he doesn't look deeply into some of this stuff, which is why he is so indignant and believes that he's not actually promulgating some of these really bad ideas. But I'm going to now we'll talk about Robert Sepper, who does. Robert Sepper is an example of the worst type of what we're talking about. Jimmy Corsetti has a lot of swastikas on his videos. He's really interested in the history of the swastika, which in and of itself isn't that big a deal, but it's partly why he takes such offense to this discussion about white supremacists, because he doesn't want the swastika to be tainted by association with the Nazis, allegedly. So, people say far right, is it just because of all my swastikas? That's my dumb meme there. Robert Sepper, whose channel is called Atlantean Gardens, I feel like we're definitely punching up. He's way more popular than he should be, because he's somebody who says, and I quote, "Before you say that Hitler ruined the ancient Aryan symbol, consider that it is banned because he actually knew what he was talking about historically. What are they hiding?" Right? So the conspiracy to suppress the swastika, according to Robert Sepper, is a conspiracy to suppress superior Aryan knowledge by, what would be the global power that he's talking about? Who is trying to suppress the Aryans, Derek? Can you guess? What's that? I was just asking, who do you think he thinks is suppressing Aryan knowledge of the swastika that was accurately understood by Hitler? That would be the Jews. What's that?
Experts in the field.
Yeah, experts in the field are suppressing it. The experts happen to be aligned with the Jewish world order, right? The worldwide Jewish conspiracy. So the world, and I'm not a Jew myself, but I have lots of friends who are Jewish. And so I've grown up around Jewish people, and I don't know, I've never met any one of them who was in on me with my conspiracy to suppress the Atlantean teachings that everyone is accusing. Okay, so he points out, for example, he believes that he calls himself a biological anthropologist because he has a bachelor's degree, which is not a terminal degree in the field of anthropology. It's enough to get a job doing like data crunching or things like that, working for Microsoft Analytics or something, but it's not like a professional anthropologist is generally going to have a master's or PhD or more. So he calls himself a biological anthropologist, despite the fact that he doesn't have advanced degrees in the discipline, and he's returning to that 19th century scientific racism. So he believes that white supremacy is a product of the fact that white people who came from Atlantis literally did invent everything, and agriculture, and that black people did, and he's a proponent of forms of polygenicism, right? So he doesn't use the old-fashioned ones where he thinks the races are completely separate, but he believes that archaic humans bred with Africans and modern humans bred with Europeans. So he sees the racial inferiority of Africans because they have more primitive, unevolved, biologically inferior ancestors. See what I mean? So it is a modern version of polygenesis. And he believes, again, that the swastika is an important global symbol of Aryan power and should be celebrated and promoted. And most importantly, most toxically, he says that the German Ahnenerbe, which is those German anthropologists, he say that they were never convicted of any wrongdoing. So he's engaging in Holocaust denial here. He's saying that the German anthropologists, except one, he mentions as a aside, except for one man, they were never convicted of any war crimes, and quote unquote, all of them went on to become top professors at leading universities. How does carpet bombing and raping Germany right, lead to any economic damage. So he's saying, despite the fact that the Allies tried to destroy the German Aryans, their anthropologists survived and became good teachers in major universities. See what he's doing there? That's really, really bad. And it's wrong. It's totally false what he said there. So I'll just point out the real Nazi stuff that he's got. His Trump bloodline video. He says that the Europeans are the real Jews. That's Christian identity stuff, right? Have you ever heard of the Christian identity movement?
Yes.
Christian
British Israelitism.
Yeah. So they include really, really far right, like KKK affiliated types who believe that the real Hebrew Israelites are white people and that the historical Jews are people who falsely claim that identity. And that, white supremacy is about restoring the Hebrew identity of white people, right? So his Trump bloodline video plays footsie with those arguments where he shows Trump worshiping at the Wailing Wall. He claims that Trump is really a Jew because he's a European, right? And then he has other ones where he claims like what Europeans are the real Native Americans and all that. It's all connected to Atlantis. And he ripped off Hancock's line, Species with Amnesia. He stole that right out of Graham Hancock for the title of his 2015 book, Our Forgotten History. And what do you notice about the logo of his publisher, of his self-publishing outfit, Atlantean Garden? See it above the book there? What do you notice about that? Does that look familiar to you, Derek?
Yeah, that kind of has this similar, isn't that a Germanic?
Yeah.
The German eagle?
It's a badly photoshopped copy of the Nazi war eagle. They accidentally cropped off the middle two talons, the third digits of the Nazi war eagle. So he literally chose the symbol of the Third Reich as the logo for his channel, right? He doesn't call himself a neo-Nazi. And he keeps it on the down low just enough that most of his subscribers don't think of him that way, right? Most of his videos don't come off. Obviously, you have to kind of do a deep dive in order to get the fact that he's legitimately a champion of the scientific racism of the early 20th century associated with the occult mystical movements before World War II. Gutsick Gibbon, Erica, wonderful. Another PhD student in anthropology. She's doing stuff with primate paleontology and stuff. She is really cool. Her channel is great. Go there, watch her stuff. She's done really good, hard debunkings of his really bad scientific racism. And so you want to learn more about Sepper's problems from biological anthropology, watch her videos about him. He thinks that she's a woke veterinarian. He says she's a Antifa BLM activist with a degree in animal science. That's what he calls. He doesn't, Erica isn't her full name isn't on the internet that I know of. She's not. Gutsick Gibbon is a PhD student in anthropology, not a veterinarian. So he's just lying there. He claims he's the real anthropologist. And by the way, most of the people who comment on his feeds are actual Nazis. There's like tons of white supremacist accounts. And with the new YouTube, since Elon Musk took over, there are dozens and dozens of Twitter accounts. There are actual neo-Nazis with tens of thousands of followers each. So like there is a booming social media presence for real old school, unreconstructed white supremacists going on right now. And people like Robert Sepper are catalysts for that. They're in the matrix that we're talking about, just to demonstrate the falsehood of his horrible claims. The honor noob was involved directly in horrific war crimes. One of the founders of the honor noob, which is the guy, he says, except for one man. The one man he's probably alluding to is Wolfram Sievers, who's in the middle there. He personally selected 112 people from a concentration camp, quarantined them, and fed them well so their bodies would be ideal museum specimens. Then he gassed them for use in scientific analysis. So he treated living prisoners. If you want to insert a trigger warning, I should have done that. I meant to do that before the slide. If you could please edit in a trigger warning before we get to the slide in case people are made uncomfortable by frank discussions of Holocaust. You might even put it before I talked about the Native American stuff before, because I'm sensitive about pulling this stuff out because it's really horrible. But like literally, he was executed at the doctor's trial. He was hanged at Nuremberg. These people were trying to prove the racial inferiority of the Jews, and they needed healthy Jewish bodies because, by the way, anthropologists had disproven scientific racism in the 1890s. People like Boas, biological anthropologists, some of whom were Germanic themselves in the United States, had already proven that skulls and human bodies did not prove racial superiority. It was already it was an established fact by the time they were doing this. They were trying to revise that. They were trying to show, no, the Jews really are racially inferior, and we can prove that. How do they do that? They took a bunch of people that they gassed on purpose to make them into museum research specimens. right? This was one of the main projects of this anthropology group. And so, yeah, he was maybe the only one who was executed at Nuremberg, but a ton of other high-ranking Ahnenerbe either were killed in action or committed suicide rather than face trial. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the organization, was the most notable one, suicide in prison. Hans Schlief, who was an archaeologist, he killed his entire family. He murdered his infant children, right? These were people who were obviously afraid of getting tried for war crimes. And a few of them did have careers after the war, even if though they were convicted by Nuremberg courts and sentenced to hard labor. And the ones that did have careers after the war did not have notable careers. They were pretty minor. So just to emphasize again, multiple anthropologists and archaeologists and geologists that worked for this outfit were tried and convicted. Many of them died in internment camps without trials, right? So there were consequences, not enough. And when he talks about some that had careers in universities, that's because Nazis were effective at whitewashing their war records. Are you aware of this? Denazification. Some prominent Nazis were able to reinvent their biographies as though they were not participating in this stuff. And that allowed them to resume their academic careers after the war. But there's only a handful that I know of. Oh, this is just the list of the people, of the 86 names that we know of those 112. These are the people whose identities have been identified that were killed as part of that research project. So these 4 guys, they had career after the war, but they didn't all go on to become top professors at leading universities around the world. Robert Sepher is lying to his Nazi audience. This is what they want to believe. So Jonkun, he successfully hid his war records, right? And he was banned from teaching. So he was legally prohibited from teaching in a university, but he did so anyway. He snuck in through guest lectures and eventually got a real job and circumvented the legal prohibition on his own ban from teaching. He eventually retired. So despite being prohibited from teaching, and he only worked in Germany, when he tried to give lectures in other parts of Scandinavia, he was banned, right? They prevented him from doing guest lectureships. So his Nazi past did not allow him to have a good career. Herman Wirth, that Dutch prehistorian, the Atlantis guy, he reinvented him as a left-wing folklorist, and he tried to get into Native American studies. Eventually, he was found out as a Nazi, and his career didn't really go where after that. But he was really believing in Atlantean Eskimos. He believed the far Arctic Native Americans were related cousins of the Aryans, right? The other guy, the anthropologist von Groghagen there, he was a private businessman. His career after the war, and he was a leader of a Greek Orthodox religious order, but he did not work in an academic setting. And then Peter Paulson, he was a state-employed museum curator after the war. He was a friend of Hitler's. He worked closely with Sievers, the butcher I talked about, that horrific human rights guy, but he did that need denazification, legally denazified. What does that mean? He rewrote his own biography as though he was forced to do what he did, that he was not a real bad Nazi. See what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so he was able to sanitize his record, and that's why he got a job as a museum curator. I am aware of no German Ahnenerbe who had major successful careers after the war. There are other German archaeologists and anthropologists who did. They were not in the Ahnenerbe. There were different anthropology organizations that were rivals within Nazi Germany. And the Ahnenerbe was just the worst of them, right? The other ones that were not as bad as they were, some of them had careers, but Robert Sepher was specifically talking about Himmler's Ahnenerbe. He was not talking about one of those other German academic outfits that had varying academic reputations. So just beware that Robert Sepher is a toxic liar who is spreading Holocaust denial on his channel under the guise of researching Atlantis. Jimmy Corsetti also uses the same images of swastikas, which I think he might have gotten right out of Sepper's book. So even though Jimmy Corsetti is not overtly pro-Nazi, he's actually a supporter of the state of Israel. He has his channel is overtly not anti-Semitic, but he is really interested in swastikas, and too many of his ideas connect directly to ideas previously published in Sepper's book to be a coincidence, right? There's a strong thematic overlap in their content, and this is a problem. So he should be aware of this and distance himself from it, but he does not. He just denies it. He says there is no basis for any of these claims, and it's like he's got his fingers in his ears about it. So, and I'm going to show you some more of his stuff in a second. So again, this is a Jimmy Corsetti tweet. He said, "Did Hitler and the Nazis know something about ancient lost history that we don't?" Right? He also rips off the Hancock line, A Species with Amnesia. To remember, that's a quote from Hancock, but it's also the title of Sepper's book, right? He believes in bizarre CIA conspiracies to cover up the pyramid magic. And like, for example, he's showing there an ancient Roman swastika-like architectural detail from Baalbek in Lebanon. So this is a Roman temple in what's now, the modern Lebanon. Do you see what he's calling a swastika there? What he's talking about ancient Hitler's lost knowledge of ancient history. Mm. That's not really a swastika. It is a swastika if you cut out the middle of it. What that is that's just a decorative pattern. A lot of ancient swastikas were just like wallpaper, right? Think about shapes. Think about triangles, circles, squares, zigzag lines. When you see a Greek mosaic, you see swirls, you see lots of geometric shapes that don't mean anything, right? They don't, just because a symbol is in art doesn't make it a religious symbol. And so it's one of the things they say, the universal ancient Aryan swastika, and they show a Roman temple with a border pattern that has a swastika-like part. So this is a good example of parallelomania. Just because something looks the same doesn't mean that it's the same symbol from the same source. Right? Does that make sense? It's not like they were intending to convey anything when they made intersecting geometric patterns in walls, right? It looked cool. I'm aware of no scholar who believes that there is like a symbolic importance to the swastika in Greco-Roman borders of architectural. And then, he uses, to criticize Flint Dibble, he attacks him with a 3 parentheses emoji. If you see where he's complaining about Flint Dibble, who he accuses of falsely accusing him of racism, and look at Flint Dibble's name has been tagged by Bright Insight there, and he uses 3 parentheses. Have you ever heard of the 3 parentheses before?
No.
It's widely known next to be an anti-Semitic code. This is just an example. He gets actual anti-Semites who comment on his posts, and he leaves them there and maybe likes them. I don't know. But these are long-standing comments from overt Hitler sympathizers all over his feeds, and he doesn't block them, he doesn't delete them, he doesn't argue with them. So these get to stand there right on his Instagram, where people are overtly praising Hitler in the context of his discussion of the ancient swastikas and what did Hitler really know? I wonder. Hitler may have been smart. See where I'm coming from here? It's not like Robert Sepper. I'm not accusing Bright Insight of being a neo-Nazi the way Robert Sepper is a closeted neo-Nazi. But he is playing footsie with these people, and he should stop. He needs to disavow this stuff if he wants people, like me, to stop pointing it out to him in public like I'm doing right now. He also tries to dox real archaeologists. He accused Flint Dibble of faking his own cancer to get out of debating Graham Hancock because it was delayed because of his chemotherapy, right? Bright Insight is the guy who called him a liar and afraid to debate. See what I'm saying there?
Yeah.
He tells his followers to leave bad Rate My Professors reviews on archaeologists' Rate My Professors sites that have criticized him. He tells them to contact their employers' HR departments to try and mess with their jobs. That really crosses the line, all because people have the temerity to point out that it's weird the way he talks about swastikas, right? The way he talks, that's all I'm saying is cut it out with the damn swastikas. Talk about them in a real historical way if you want to, but don't act like it's some mystical question about whether Hitler was right or not. That's the only thing I want him to do differently, and he won't. And he's a prominent defender of Hancock on Joe Rogan. So I think that he's got a very big platform for this stuff. And he accuses the World Economic Forum of suppressing archaeological excavations. That is commonly associated with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. The World Economic Forum is targeted by people who believe in a global Jewish conspiracy. So he connects into it that way too. Yeah, here he is trying to remember the archaeologist who signed the letter complaining about science fiction on Graham Hancock's channel. This was the letter of the Society for American Archaeology. He points out to his followers that they can be contact their employers. Look these people up, right? And I've blocked out individual names. Flint Dibble and I are out in front of this right now, so we're exposed. But I don't want to share any of these details of other people. And this is where the triple parentheses. So it's the echo notation. Some Jewish people online have reappropriated it and reclaim it. Like, so some Jewish people will use triple parentheses as a way of saying, I'm a proud Jew, but it originated in online forums where people talk about for people with the worldwide Jewish conspiracy, right? So if you put someone's name in a set of 3 parentheses, it means this is like the way that echoes of Jewish control are felt throughout society. So that's what the symbol of the echo means around a name. So if you put like George Soros, he's a Jew who's often claimed as one of the worldwide Jewish conspiracy leaders. So you put George Soros's name in echoes and it's saying his impact echoes throughout civilization. So the fact that Jimmy Corsetti used the 3 parentheses notation to talk about Flint Dibble in his critical tweets, and then later said he had no idea that had anything to do with Judaism, and that's just a woke mob revising history and something that was nothing to do with Jews. But it's not just Flint who's saying that. It's like the Anti-Defamation League. This has been well known for a long time that this is and it also means the global octopus, like the octopus's tentacles, the 3 tentacles that wrap around each side of the earth, right? See the Star of David and the octopus. Those are from Nazi era political cartoons. And then you see again, when he criticizes the World Economic Forum in his tweet, who replies? See the tweet in the bottom right-hand corner? Mm-hmm. Actual anti-Semites come and say, oh, you don't like the World Economic Forum? You know, it's run by the Jews. So getting back to Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval. Graham Hancock is not one of these guys, even though Corsetti is one of his defenders and is connected to him through Rogan and has been a vocal critic of anyone who criticizes Hancock. I want to be clear that Graham Hancock is not a racist, personally. He is not trying to advance racist ideas in his work. So do not come away from this thinking that I'm accusing Graham Hancock of doing the things I'm accusing Robert Sepper of doing. Graham Hancock is not one of them. Nonetheless, he and his co-author, Robert Bauval, have written books about modern conspiracy theories that do also intersect with those same ideas. So there are 1 or 2 places, and when people say that Hancock needs to do a better job disavowing of this stuff, it's these kinds of books that we're talking about. So he and Robert Bauval's books about modern conspiracy theories, he's written a bunch of them. He's written books about the Sphinx and books about modern states and global conspiracies in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. And this is a review from The Independent of the book Talisman there, which talks about the Jewish Masonic conspiracy that the far right likes, and which comes out in chapter 19, and particularly in the appendix of that book, The Semblance of a Zionist Masonic Conspiracy. They're talking about the impression in the wake of they're talking about like the Freemasons controlling the US presidency and establishing the state of Israel, right? And that the revenge attack against the state of Israel through the United States by the Taliban, who are enemies of the global Masonic/Jewish conspiracy. So these ideas do come out in this work of Hancock's. He should be aware that they have a long history related to the Atlantis stuff that he also likes so much. And he should be explicit about it. He should talk about it more. He should stop sweeping it under the rug. This doesn't make him a racist. It does make him somebody who is being willfully naive about the relationship between these sets of ideas. So the last guy that I'm going to talk about is Frank Joseph. He was a major player in Atlantis research in the late 20th century, early 21st century. He was the editor of Ancient American Magazine. I know people who published in that magazine back in the day. It was a prominent magazine for pseudo-archaeology. He is the author of the book, The Destruction of Atlantis, which was published in 1987, and a bunch of other books. And he is friends with Robert Bauval, Graham Hancock's co-author, the guy who wrote the chapter 19. In Hancock's defense, by the way, the last one, that chapter was mostly written by Bauval, not by Hancock. But Hancock edited the book. Hancock put one voice to the book, right? He acknowledged that the entire book is in his name. See what I'm saying? So Hancock is still responsible for what the book says. So Bauval is somebody who was on the lecture circuit with Frank Joseph in the 1990s and 2000s, and he wrote the blurb on The Destruction of Atlantis. So Bauval is the guy who writes The Destruction of Atlantis. cover blurb. So more books by Joseph next. He's obviously a publisher. He's written as an author on the Simon & Schuster website. His original name was Frank Collin. He changed his name in the 1980s. These are his other books, Ancient High Technology. He wrote the introduction to time travel with the pyramids. He believes we've evolved from dolphins, our dolphin ancestors. Power play. You can read a really good review of his book, Power Places and the Master Builders of Antiquity, written by my friend Jason Colavito at his blog. So go to his blog and read that book review if you want to hear more about him. A lot of stuff about Atlantis, a lot of stuff about lost civilizations of prehistoric America, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Lemuria, all of it. He is the founder of the American Nazi Party in the late 1970s. He's the guy who led the Skokie race riots. He had a Supreme Court case argued over his right to free expression when he led Nazi mobs against Jewish neighborhoods in Illinois in the 70s. He went to jail for sex crimes against children in the early 1980s. And the Nazis kicked him out because evidently the Nazi party that he helped found was okay with Nazism, but not okay with sex with kids. So I guess they had to draw the line somewhere. He renamed himself Frank Joseph and became a Atlantis researcher after he got out of prison in the 80s. And he's most well known probably because the Henry Gibson character in the movie with Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi, The Blues Brothers, the Henry Gibson character is based on Frank Joseph or Frank Collin because he was infamous in the period of the Skokie race riots. So, which was, again, when I was a baby. I was born in the late 70s. It's a famous scene where they say to the Blues Brothers say to each other in the car, "I hate Illinois Nazis."
Illinois Nazis. I hate Illinois Nazis.
He is the Illinois Nazi they are talking about. The Nazis are holding a rally on the bridge. Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi drive their car over the bridge and cause Henry Gibson and his jackbooted Nazi guys to jump off and fall into the river. Splash. So there you go. So that's the famous. So you might have, if you've seen the Blues Brothers, you've seen a character based on the historical Atlantis researcher, Frank Joseph. He was going to be the author of the month on the Graham Hancock webpage in 2010 in July. But fortunately, and as a credit to the website and to the people around Hancock at the time, they prevented that. Another Atlantis researcher who I am going to call out for praise right now, Ian Driscoll, who is a pro-Atlantis researcher in Hancock's circle of authors, who red flagged Frank Joseph, who probably got plugged into Hancock's network via Robert Bauval, right? He red flagged him as being too much of a Nazi, right? Definitely not worth making author of the month in July 2010 on the Graham Hancock webpage, and they nixed it. So that's great. I'm glad. Bravo, Graham Hancock. Bravo, Ian Driscoll. That's what we're asking that they do more of. They need to start being explicit and differentiating their work from the stuff that is truly aligned with darkest historical moments in the last 100 years. And that's all I got, Derek, for today. Next time, we're going to go and do a deep dive into Hancock's books. And we're going to talk about the way they relate to other books. I would like to have a sequel to this, and hopefully that one won't go 4 hours.
Look, this was a deep, deep dive. We dealt with the myth of Atlantis, what proponents of this advanced ancient civilization do when they're looking at this material. We dove into comparative mythology and kind of how these myths are actually dependent in some way culturally through cross-pollination, if you will, of ideas and motifs. And this is fascinating. This takes us deeper. We can go in further into different things. I'm looking forward to seeing what you bring next time. I hope everybody enjoyed this. Be sure to check out the links in the description and like the video. Share this out there to someone else so they can take a deep dive into this as well. Thank you for your time and your insights. I did not know most of this stuff, especially towards the end, especially when Flint Dibble made the statements on Joe's channel, on Joe's podcast, and Joe immediately, that was one of the highlights of that debate that happened that derailed from just direct interaction. No, we need to address this. You're making false claims and false accusations. What can Flint do when Joe is literally ignorant on knowing these things? And if he isn't, mind you, I want to tug at his patriotic string. He moved out of California. You could tell he has more of a middle to right leaning, it seems, by Joe Rogan's podcast. Well, listen, let's tug at those strings for a second. Joe, are you fans of Nazism? Are you fans of these things? Would you not want to stand against those. I would. And that's enough patriotism in me to say I would stand against these, American patriotism, against Nazi ideas, against the fascist crap that happened with Hitler and stuff. And if that's the case, then you, quick to vocalize your opinions, should vocalize against this and say, yeah, we should wash our hands and make sure we have no stain of this on us. That is my cry, my call out to someone like Joe and others to do a little research, to look into this. What are your thoughts?
I absolutely agree. And I will reiterate again that I am not hostile to fantastic claims about the past on their merits, on their surface. I want to ask questions that may strike some of my colleagues as crazy. And I want to listen to people with evidence and ideas that I don't agree with. And I want them to have a place. I want journals to publish articles that show dissenting views about ancient history. I think that's fine. I think that's healthy. I think that's what people want to read. I think one of the reasons why archaeology is considered boring, right? And Graham Hancock is considered interesting, why he has so many followers, so many people watching him, and why he has so much influence is partially on our side, a result of our failure to respectfully engage with the ideas as the ideas. But we must continue to draw a line in the sand where those ideas lead to harmful social consequences. So I guess that makes me like Plato, right? Plato, or I should say, we don't want to kill it with silence. I'm maybe not like Plato. I don't think we should sweep the awful truth about the past under the rug. We need to live with it. Just like in my main discipline of archaeology and anthropology and religion studies, there are lots of horrible people who did mainstream work, right? Lots of less than ideal perfect humans in the history of archaeology. When we learn the history of archaeology, we learn about them, right? If we were talking about the history of archaeology, I could talk to you about the awful people that do mainstream work too. It doesn't help the Atlantis people by pretending this stuff doesn't exist, by denying that any basis for comparison with the Nazi ideas is valid when there is a direct pedigree, like a direct historical pedigree, not with the ancient 19th century ideas, but through 20th century scholarship. And we will get into that next time. We'll talk about the stuff from the post-war period that was written about Atlantis and how it integrated these different streams of thought and repackage it in a new way that people were ignorant and unaware of the Nazi affiliations of certain of the proponents at the time, right? That's when the stuff was swept under the rug to a degree. And we have to use cleansing sunlight. We need to both be respectful and acknowledge that outsider opinions have merit, but also recognize where those problems exist. That's my final say.
Thank you so much. Everyone, share this thing far and wide.